some? Just because some of us assumed they had somebody from the school.
That's a dangerous assumption to be made. If you've ever read Lord of the Flies, Animal Farm, what's that other one that you might hear with kids take over the
We should run a bill on
summer camp.
Just sell it. So it's tall. Crank.
Medium. Okay, look, if you're gonna sit that close, if you're gonna sit that close with that big a lens, all right? Jeez.
I'll leave it to the better chair.
Well, you can be able to count them.
You guys ready?
Yep.
How Chuck is a jerk.
All right, let's go ahead and call the meeting back to order. We have a quorum.
We do have a quorum, Mr. Chip.
Not too bad. 1:15, I'm shooting for 1:30, so we're ahead of schedule. Just got to set your expectations.
Low.
Okay, so we'll pick back up where we were, and again, we were talking about amendments to the Trust Act, and then we have listed Chris Ryman and Barbara Hafe. Okay. All right. Would you guys please come forward, introduce yourself, say who you're with, and I understand you're part of the working group that Commissioner Faulkner had mentioned earlier. Okay.
Chairman and committee members, thank you for having us. I'm Barbara Haft. I am a member of the Endow Executive Council. I represent the trust and financial services sector for Endow. I have been in Wyoming since 1984. Actually, tomorrow is the anniversary of my arrival in the state at the tender age of 22. I founded Willow Street in 2005, and I've been involved in the trust and family office services industry for over 25 years. So in addition to the task force that Albert Faulkner referred to, we are also in the process of and have formed the Wyoming Trust Association. That's a multidisciplinary group that includes trust companies, law firms, accounting firms, wealth managers, and banks. And what we're hoping and planning to do with the Trust Association is to create a collaborative atmosphere between all of the different professional services industries that work together on this on trusts and on the financial services sector, and really work on keeping Wyoming the great jurisdiction that it is. So I think the Wyoming Legislature has done an incredible job of creating good statute, and I think that it's truly considered, in fact, the quote that I received on a recent trip to New Zealand from the trust industry representatives that I met with, they actually described it as Wyoming is an increasingly prominent jurisdiction in international asset planning. And that's partly, if not mostly, due to the quality statute that we have. As Albert Faulkner said, this is also an opportunity for us to continue to fine-tune what we do. It's not so much really affecting the internal workings of the industry within the state. It's primarily a way of keeping us competitive with other jurisdictions. And by that I mean states like South Dakota, Nevada, Delaware. A lot of states have started to imitate Wyoming. That includes the private family trust company statutes. We are one of only 2 states in the nation that offers both unregulated and regulated private family trust companies. Our firm, Willow Street, has over 30 private trust companies that we administer for a variety of families. I also have 2 that I use to act as a corporate trustee. And in addition, we received our charter to act as an independent trust company in 2016. So, essentially, Albert also referred to the fact that there is a huge market for this. The it's a conservative estimate that $41 trillion will be changing hands from one generation to another. A lot of these families have large operating businesses. This represents opportunities for us, but I think that there's a few things that we can accomplish with this legislation. So essentially the streamlining of the statute creates some government efficiency, which I think that everyone can be on board with. I think that helps the state agencies, but it also helps the marketing of Wyoming. When they looked at our statute, they want to see clean, clear statute that is easy to follow and understand and that is relevant specifically to the trust company industry. Some of the definitions that we have that we talk about changing in the statute from our working group, those are things that are also, we want to be on parity with other jurisdictions. In addition, some of the things that we use are actually on parity with the Security and Exchange Commission. So once again, what we want is we want to be, if not on parity, then certainly competitive. And changing the statute and creating some streamlining is actually the way to do that. So
I just want to interrupt just a little bit, Ms. Haft. I'm going to get this right too. So, and this would fall into the question Representative Lindholm had asked me earlier. But so the state of South Dakota got out ahead of most states in terms of their statutory structure, and that's yielded some good benefits for them in terms of the development of their, I guess particularly in the East River area, Sioux Falls. And you being on the subcommittee or for Endow, what do you see with the development of the Wyoming Code? I mean, our statutes in terms of helping with our our Uniform Trust Code, again with Title 13 here, Chapter 5, these proposed amendments. I know we've had discussions about being able to work on a foundation section in Title 17. But how do you see that benefiting us overall?
Well, and thank you for asking that, because one of the things that Endow did was do a really deep dive on a socioeconomic assessment of the state and did a comparison between our state and similar states. And it wasn't a surprise to me, but when you do the comparison of what percentage of GDP is happening as a result of the financial services and professional services firms in our state at 4.5% versus over 20% for South Dakota, you can see that that represents a huge opportunity. And these are actually, it's a non-correlated industry, so it is, it doesn't matter whether the price of coal or crude or gas goes up or down, people still need access to capital, and they also still want to maintain their legacy assets, and that's what our industry does. So South Dakota has done a great job. They've been working on it since the 70s. So have we, actually. I mean, again, we've had private trust company legislation since 1977, so that's something that we say when we go out in the world, hey, Wyoming's had private trust companies for 40 years, 50 years. So, but South Dakota, one thing that they do, they are constantly fine-tuning their legislation and statute, and they are collaborating. There's a strong collaboration between government agencies and the private sector, and they have a real strong representation both in the marketplace and as they have a trust industry association that actually lists and has all relevant statute online, and you can just go online and actually click a button and find out anything you want to find out about independent trust companies, private trust companies, banks. All the relevant statute is ready and available for you. So that's one of the things, it's an initiative that eventually we'll be getting to as part of our work with Endow and the Financial Services and Trust Industry Subcommittee.
Representative Lindholm.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think those are really good comparisons and the kind of things that I think Endow and everybody is looking for and should be looking for. Is there any specific aspects with the, and I'm not looking for a detailed explanation of the amendments we're looking at, but are there any specific aspects that Wyoming could chase in regards to these trusts that might put us either A, closer to South Dakota, because they are way out in front, or B, give us maybe even an edge?
Well, thank you, Representative Lindholm and Mr. Chairman. Actually, Mr. Chairman Greer actually referred to foundations, and that is actually a slight fine-tuning that would set us ahead of the rest of the nation in terms of additional types of trusts that we could have here in the state. But really what we're representing today is what we need to do to be competitive. So again, making it easier for the independent trust company to apply for a charter, and that's not to say that we're not making it or suggesting that it should be easy. We have to be a well-regulated jurisdiction, and we need to be extremely vigilant about maintaining the credibility that we have currently as a jurisdiction in the international marketplace. But the other things that we're representing here, the slightly changed definition to having 2 designated relatives for the chartered family trust company, the ability to, once again, have separate applications to make it more efficient for the government to be able to reply to the application process. I think that there just needs to be some areas of clarity. Now, I'm not an attorney, and I think Chris will be able to speak more to some of the technical details.
Of course, Representative Lindholm wants to ask how our blockchain legislation will help in that.
Didn't say nothing.
Can I actually say that, seeing that, I don't know if the rest of the committee has seen it, and I can certainly send out a link, but I received a link. We work with an international law firm that has offices in 60 different countries, and that law firm reached out to us this past week to say, hey, we saw this article, it was picked up by the AP, it was in the New York Times online version, and it had quotes from Representative Lindholm, but also from one of the attorneys that specializes in blockchain technology. Cryptocurrency, of course, uses blockchain technology, but his comment was Wyoming is pro-business, and this just shows it. This is an example of Wyoming's being pro-business. So thank you. I mean, if that, again, once again, you're lending credibility, and that particular attorney has ties to Wyoming, to Lander.
Any further questions? Then you want to? Good. Okay. You want to give us a fly-through on the proposed amendments, or how do you want to tackle them? Introduce yourself to the committee, please, Chris.
Thank you, Chairman Greer, members of the committee. My name is Christopher Reimer, and I am a lawyer in private practice for the law firm of Long, Reimer, Weininger, Beppler. I actually grew up 80 miles from here in Newcastle, where my parents still live and my wife's parents still live. Went to University of Wyoming for undergraduate accounting degree and law degree, and basically thought that I knew I wanted to be a, quote, estate planner, and thought I'd be, doing estate plans for business owners and ranch owners in Wyoming, and went and got a master's in tax at DU. And I did not take fiduciary income tax or international taxation, because I was like, I'll never use those 2 things. And 15 years later, that is basically what my practice is, and what this business of trust companies does is deal with people from other states, countries, and more and more this international aspect, as the commissioner mentioned. So my perspective here is as a private practitioner and attorney. I'm here to lend support to the Division of Banking in adopting this. Basically, just from personal experience, I think you mentioned there's something like 13 trust companies now. I've been involved in a half a dozen of those getting up off the ground over the last 15 years. And I would like to reiterate the point that nothing, generally what we're doing here is not changing, but filling in the gaps, because there's a quite robust banking statute. And then there's a little piece of it which deals with non-depository trust companies. And then there's another piece of that which deals with these family chartered trust companies. And I think it was Representative Lindholm who asked, what's the 6% rule about? And that's a perfect example. I don't know the history behind what's the 6% rule for a preferred interest in a bank, but I looked up on my phone when you asked the question, and that's straight out of the bank statute. And what we're doing is filling the gaps in the trust company statute, so that when a client comes to me and says, hey, I've got a non-depository trust company, or I want to form it, or I have one, can I do a preferred membership interest or preferred stock? And literally my answer today would be maybe, and I would call Albert, Mr. Forkner, and we would look at the statutes, and we'd find that in the bank statute. We would say it's not really in the trust company statute, but we could maybe use the bank as an example. And we run into that in other instances, like how you terminate and wind up a trust company. Is there a duty to give notice to the Division of Banking when you're changing ownership of a trust company? There's clearly a duty under the banking statute, but it's not in the trust company statute. So we're basically taking what's a bare bones trust company statute and expanding it to fill in all the gaps. And then of the few things I've heard people talking about, there are these two maybe items that do change policy, which is this idea of key employee and two ancestors, which I'd like to talk about those specifically. But before I do that, to give you a sense of where we are and why this makes sense in the progression of updating and changing Wyoming's trust laws, is that we, unlike South Dakota basically said, come be a bank or a credit card processor or a trustee here, and we'll do underlying statutes to help you. What we have done is went straight to the heart of the trust laws, not trust company laws. So it was 15 years ago, July 1, 2003, that the Uniform Trust Code was enacted by Wyoming. And I'll never forget, my now partner, Tom Long, came into this little cubby I was working in and handed me this stack of paper and said, this is the Uniform Trust Code. It's going to change the way we do business completely. And ever since then, we have sort of on an informal basis kept track of what South Dakota is doing, Delaware is doing, and used basically the interest in trusts coming to Wyoming to already established trust companies, which there used to be 2 and now there's a dozen, to finding that we find ourselves where more and more of the trust companies themselves want to come here or are being formed, like by Willow Street, and the rules governing the trust company are outdated and they have gaps, and that's the impetus of this update, is to catch up our trust company statutes with the underlying trust statutes, which we generally try to update every other session, working with people like Chairman Greer. So without getting into the weeds of what this does, this is literally completing the whole, filling in the gaps of what we have right now when people ask us nitty-gritty questions about what are the rules regarding trust companies in Wyoming. With respect to the 2 things that could be considered policy changes, there's this idea of a key employee. And what that is that when a family likes to do their own investment management, they usually don't hire commercial companies to do that. They go and they pluck the manager that's been working with their family for 15 years at J.P. Morgan and say, leave J.P. Morgan, come to work for us. And as a perk of being able to do that, you'll be able to invest whatever you have personally alongside the family. When we're in the so-called beauty contest of jurisdictions, and I have a family that's coming to me and says, we want to come and be regulated by the state of Wyoming, we have had instances where and can our key employees be a part of the structure? Or do we have to kick them out and say, no, you can't be part of the family investment platform, you have to go hire Raymond James or whoever? They're not going to use Wyoming as the solution in that instance. And it's those key employees are the people that invest the family's funds, which is a hugely important job for that family office. So if they can't bring them with them and plug them into the system, it's almost an immediate hang-up. And the other jurisdictions that have these animals, these regulated private family trust companies for a single family, allow their key employees to invest along with them. And so we're clearly at a disadvantage by not having that.
Can I build on that for a little bit? So it's not necessarily that there are thousands of family offices with key employees, with huge, set groups of employees that want to come here and do that. When Chris refers to the beauty contest, that's what I'm coming up against. What I'm seeing is in our trade journals and Trust and Estates magazines and the Wall Street Journal, when they're actually comparing Wyoming to other states, we're showing up in the second tier. We have so much that is valuable, but because we don't have those little nuances, we're less than competitive. So I just wanted to point that out. It's not that, I do definitely, I think there are some families that specifically have not chosen us for that very reason. But really on a marketing and competitive edge, that's what I think is very important.
And then I guess the only other so-called policy change is this idea of a second ancestor. And right now, our definition of what is a family for purposes of creating one of these entities and moving the administration to someone like Willow Street in Wyoming says that you have to have a single designated relative. And it's not uncommon in the modern wealthy family to have a branch, for whatever reason, that just doesn't fit that definition. And by opening that up, just barely opening the door and saying, okay, this is a single family, but there's maybe one other offshoot that's not perfect, that'll really give us a competitive edge to being able to say we're better than the other jurisdictions. I have a situation where I've found another way to solve it, but I have a situation where two families, some of the largest, they're farming in California, and they use a series of private trust companies, but had this rule, it would have been easier to get to yes, to say, okay, we're going to use Wyoming as our family's, the part of our family that's going to basically set the rules regarding, with respect to investing and keeping basically the family farm together, although in that instance it had two families.
Committee, any questions? Yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On the second ancestor, I just need to understand that a little better. I mean, you're speaking of somebody that is related in some manner, either through legal means or through blood. What do you mean by second ancestor, or second family member, I guess is what it's...
So at the moment, there has to be a single person that everybody can trace back to, essentially through blood or marriage. The addition of the second ancestor would essentially allow what under the current rules would be two families to use the same structure to accomplish the goal.
So I have an example. So, I think Mr. Forkner actually had a similar example that we've seen where we've solved the problem with multiple trust companies. But, for example, there are two families that start a pharmaceutical business, and they're not related, they're simply business partners, but they have over the years created this huge enterprise that has ultimately diversified into a multitude of industries. And they own pieces of the same company in different trusts. And those trusts are being managed by a variety of types of trustees. They want to consolidate. They want that flexibility that an independent trust company gives them so they can manage their operating business continually together in the aggregate and be able to do that under one umbrella. So that having two separate families that are not related by blood or marriage, but that are interested in investing in the aggregate for whatever reason, they would like to have that option and be able to do that in Wyoming.
Thank you. So in that case, they're not or legally, marriage or something. There's no blood involved. And why is that so different than what we would regulate today, or they would go to a Raymond James or, some other investment firm? We just want has other states opened this up and to have the second ancestor? Okay, I didn't know this.
Senator Von Flattern, I believe it is Florida that has the two ancestor rule now. and I do not believe it is legislation yet, but the rumor in the circles that we follow is that Nevada is going to open it up to 5 ancestors.
And that, Mr. Chair, if I can follow up here. So that's my question. Why are we doing 2? Why aren't we doing 5 or 10 or 20? I mean, it becomes a regular investment club, I guess, is what you're setting up now. And so that's why I wonder why we're saying 2.
Senator Bonflatter, in my experience, the policy of the state of Wyoming and working with the division is that these are allowed because they're for a single family and they're not a commercial enterprise. There are instances where we have a single family, but let's say we have someone that gets remarried and that person's son, which has no blood relation to the original ancestor that we picked, they'll come to us and say, can we bring that person's investments into the family business? And oftentimes they'll have to say, no, that person doesn't qualify. Whereas if we just had the ability to say, okay, we can use 2, we can maintain the policy of this is a single family type of business. It's not trying to get into the commercial of 5 or 10 or 15 families or a multi-family office. This is a per family enterprise, but it would be really handy if we could have a little exception here and there.
Yeah, Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, so as I'm listening to you, I think you're saying that if we do these nuances to the statutes, that we will make it easier for people to do estate planning or maybe bring more estate planners into the state. What are the benefits to the state or the citizens of the state for doing this?
Do you want to take it? Well, I'm so glad you asked. Thank you, Senator Anderson and Mr. Chair. On the micro level, honestly, we're seeing it in our own firms and in our own communities where, for example, my company's gone from 5 to 12 people in 3 years, and we're still growing. We're looking for additional office space all the time. If you drive in front of the largest CPA firm in Cheyenne, you'll see on the front of their building it says CPAs, Trusts, Consulting, because now a huge compartment and department in their company is devoted to the trust industry and international cross-border transactions and tax reporting. On a more macro level, our clients and advisors use banks. So we're non-depository independent trust companies. So on any given day, our clients and families are depositing tens of millions of dollars into local bank accounts that are in turn being used for residential and commercial credit facilities. Our clients use residential and commercial credit facilities. It's, you talked about it earlier for the state of Wyoming. Well, our families are doing the same thing. When they can be making more money with investments than it costs to borrow, they borrow money to buy the ranch, or they borrow money for the operating business rather than take money out of their trusts or other entities. The other thing that they do is they provide access to capital. So our families they're direct investing, they're angel investing, they're mentoring small businesses, they're buying and building operating businesses, and they're providing access to capital. So I think that those are, clear benefits to the state. And honestly, especially from my work with Endow, I am encouraging, I meet so many people from Wyoming who no longer live in Wyoming that have these extraordinary talents, and they're looking for reasons to come back here. And I think that, giving them the understanding that, hey, we're cutting edge, we're competitive, we have opportunities, bring your intellectual property law practice to Wyoming. Come back and you're a CPA, you've had experience with Price Waterhouse, you've lived in Germany, come back to Wyoming. I'm sure Guernsey would be thrilled to see you again. I feel like these are opportunities, these are the benefits of us creating these nuances. So thank you for asking the question, Senator.
Okay, so so if today, if you had a second ancestor, I'm so hung up on this, but I'll try to get through it. If you have this, do you have to go to a regular investment company for both of you to invest in something? What is regulated, not regulated? What does this create that we would be alleviating?
So when you have a family that does their own investment and has decided to do that in-house and not hire a third-party investment manager, they have to meet what's called the single-family office definition under the SEC to avoid being regulated by the SEC. And that's a strict single ancestor rule. What families are doing are seeking out to be regulated by a state rather than the SEC, because the relationship with a state regulator is usually a lot nicer experience than the SEC, which is designed to basically punish activity. By expanding our definition of a family a little bit outside of the Securities and Exchange definition, like Florida has done, is going to encourage families that have already decided not to use a third-party investment advisor. Okay, they're going to do it themselves. They're either going to have to go get regulated by the SEC, or they're going to pick a state to be regulated by. And in this case, we want them to come pick Wyoming to be their regulator.
I may follow up on that one is, so if we do allow the second ancestor, what we are saying is that in the SEC, okay, let me rephrase that. If the SEC will allow us to set this standard, and we won't be running afoul of them in their own regulations?
Senator Von Flattern, if a trust company, family or otherwise, is regulated by a state entity like the Wyoming Division of Banking, they are by definition not an investment advisor under the Investment Advisory Act.
Okay, so it's regulation light. Just stay in theme.
But it's still well regulated, right? It's still well regulated.
Yeah, go ahead, speak to that just a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the things, I mean, literally in the past 6 months, I've been in New York, Florida, Chicago, London, Auckland, New Zealand. All of those are trust jurisdictions in some way, shape, or form. And so, you know, you can basically, you cut out any jurisdiction that has an income tax, and you winnow down the number of countries and states. And the states and the countries that are successful are the ones that are well regulated, but that have a collaborative industry between the private sector and the public sector. And I think that that's something that Wyoming already has. I think it helps that we're a smaller state, that we know each other. I think that the Division of Banking, it's a really efficient agency. And they're also, their mentality is, we want you to be successful. We're going to help you understand what it is that is expected of you. We do a lot of due diligence, and that way we make sure that we're inviting the best quality participants in the industry into the state. But to do that you need to be well regulated. You need to understand the statute. You need to have the willingness to set up a task force and that brings in stakeholders. And I think that's the definition of well regulated.
Thank you. Any further questions by the committee? Okay. And Mr. Giese, we had you listed next, and if you'll stick close by, if we have any more questions, we'll pull you back up. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Mike Giese with the Wyoming Bankers Association. The Wyoming Bankers Association has what we call a trust committee, which is 5 individuals from banks that have trusts. So as we see any type of changes that happen in any of the trust statutes, we obviously would like to be involved and be part of that because it does affect us. And a simple example would be when you go from 1 to 35, it's kind of like maybe it's open to the public. And so I guess some of the questions are, we're not against regulations, and we're not against bringing new companies into Wyoming, all of those things, but we don't want regulation where it disadvantages the trust companies that are already here to the point that they're doing something that now somebody else can do. When we originally started this process, the idea was to have a single family trust where an individual could have and manage his own money. But now, as we see these things, we just like to be involved in part of the process, and we understand that Albert's put this forward. We would have liked to have been on that original committee that did part of that. We weren't. We're very concerned about the amount of examination that takes place. We're extremely examined all the time by that department. We'd like to see those same regulations, attuned to protect those folks that are in the single-family trust, because it's a concern for the state. If something happens in one of these single-family trusts, who are they going to look to? They're going to look to the people that chartered it, and they're going to say, what responsibility did you have here? So it's a concern. We want to see the same. We'd like to see parity within everything in terms of the regulations, in terms of the way we do things. So we'd like to be part of this process. Albert has given us the information, and we've reviewed this. And obviously we had some concerns, which I just expressed. That's the number of managers that can be part of the deal. In other words, that dips directly into those people that have public trust in the banks, and then also that area of examination. And so we'd just like to be part of the process as it moves forward, and I would stand for any questions.
Mr. Giese, what areas of examination are being affected by the proposed amendments? Is there a change there?
Mr. Chairman, we'd like to see the same process that they go through in the banks when they examine to be taking place at the same level. And I don't know exactly what they do, and I'm giving you the information that comes from my trust committee, which tells me I don't know a thing about trust, I'll be honest with you. But the trust committee said we'd like to see a little bit more robust examinations done on the single-family trust as part of this new statute.
Okay, the policy decision on how these would be regulated was made 6 years ago, and I still recall some discussion from that. Okay, well, yeah, go ahead, Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Giese, I won't put you on the spot at this point in time, but I would like to know more about the details of what's lacking from the current auditing procedures and what your trust board is specifically interested in that isn't being done now as we move forward with this. So if you'd follow up with them and get a better understanding so that we can understand better, I would appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, we would do that, and I'm sure that they will. We only got a look at this a couple of weeks ago, so as I said, we weren't part of the process. And maybe if we would have been part of the process, maybe some of these issues could have been ironed out. And I hear them, they want to be regulated because it does. It presents a very good face for the state of Wyoming, is you can come into the state. We know that they're going to take good care of the folks that are part of those trusts because they have good, solid regulations. We've heard that from the single-family trust folks.
So, again, where we're at in this process was to introduce this concept, these amendments. I personally, as chairman, pushed to try to get a draft in front of us so that we could look at moving forward with a bill draft, which would then be distributed publicly and available for comment. I would hope if there are competing interests in the state of Wyoming on an issue like this, that they would get together and discuss what is appropriate so that we have those particulars in front of us when we go to make policy decisions. No, we appreciate your comments. Any questions from the committee? Anyone else from the public have any comment? Okay. So with that committee, I guess I'm looking for a motion to get a bill draft for us to consider at what I was hoping would be our Laramie meeting.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we direct staff to work with the Division on Banking and the Commissioner to develop a draft based on the preliminary draft that we provided today for consideration for the meeting.
Who was the second down there? Senator Hank Coe was the second. It's like a second plus. Yeah. Okay. Any further discussion? Yeah, Senator Anderson. Yeah, if you want to answer that, Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the degrees of lineage, that's specific to the family line. What we're talking about is adding a separate second family line as a possibility. So it would be two separate families conceptually, each with that same degree of lineage. Does that make sense, Senator? Mr. Chairman, yes.
Yeah, it's a policy change. So now if you had two brothers that maybe started a business, you know, they would pick their father a common lineage, and then that could go on down to great-great-grandchildren within that trust, within a private family trust. Now they're saying if two brothers and a really good friend started a business that was wildly successful, you wouldn't have to have a trust for the brothers and a trust for the other person. You could actually bring them together and manage them as one. And that's the big policy change. Senator Coe, did you have a question?
I was wondering what the magic is about the number 35 at the top of page 3.
Mr. Reimer, would you speak to that for us, please?
Chairman Greer, I believe that is the number that's in the SEC definition of a single family. They allow this idea of a key employee. So I'd have to go back and check for sure, but certainly other states have chosen that number in their, like Florida, in their definitions of key employee. And I can see it in my mind. I don't have it here with me, but I have a summary of how multiple states have addressed the key employee issue, and including the number, and I could very easily produce that. Oh.
So, okay, and Mr. Reimer, if you've got the answer, that's great. If not, if you could find if that's an SEC limitation or something and email that to the committee, that would be helpful to us.
So just quickly looking at this, Mr. Chairman, I don't see that 35 is in the SEC, but it certainly is in the New Hampshire rule. But I'm happy to further follow up to explain what other states have used 35.
Mr. Reimer, I do have a question, but it says persons designated as key employees shall not exceed 35. So it's not 35 within the trust or any limit on that if you're in the fifth or fourth or third relative down, but it's key employees. And so your trust now could have up to 35 other people that are unrelated by blood in this trust, family trust?
Mr. Chairman and Senator Von Flattern, I actually haven't seen a situation where a family would ever need to use 35. I can see the other states have chosen that number, and that's why it's in ours. But the purpose of it is so that if you have a team, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a particular client, but most people who pick their own investments, whether that be stocks every day or looking at private equity, it's not just one guy, it's a team of 4 or 5 really smart women and men who make that determination for the family in-house, and they're not related. They've been plucked from the JP Morgans of the world to go and work for that specific family. So you are right, there would be, under this rule, up to 35 employees. We actually internally, as the task force, talked about this the other day, and it was another attorney on the phone who mentioned that he had a scenario where he could see, especially if you get to stay a key employee through retirement, you could maybe have 10 people now, you might have 20 in 20 years, you might have 30 in 30 years, but by then people are going to be dying, and so you'd never need more than 35, but you could see how that's a nice number.
Yeah, follow up on this. So and it's so broad a language, it says a former employee of the family trust, an eligible trust, or a family affiliate. So basically that's just, this is the top page, whatever that, page 3. So basically anybody you designate could be involved. It doesn't have to be a former employee. We were talking about a former employee before a key employee being designated to join this trust or to invest with the group. Now we're at 35 and we don't have to be an employee anymore. So I'm a little confused by this because it seems we're opening this up to everybody and their brother to join this investors club.
Chairman Greer, Senator, I'd be happy to show you the other states from which we pulled the language that we decided to use. As a personal, in my experience, I wouldn't have a scenario for one of these single families where there would be 35 people that they would need to use that. So I would agree with you that number might be higher than it would need to be, but it would sure be nice to not lose the business for the state when our competitors say, you can come to the state, be regulated, and someone other than a family member, including a key employee or a former key employee. If I could touch on the purpose of affiliate. So the purpose of affiliate, if you look at the definition, these family structures tend to have more than one entity. So there'll be the private trust company, which is the fiduciary named in the trust document. The people who are picking stocks in private equity don't necessarily have to be, or typically aren't employees of the private trust company. They're employees of in the structure of the family, there'll be a separate entity whose sole job is to do the investment management. Still owned and controlled by the same family, but it is a separate entity. It's not the private trust company that those people get their W-2 wage from. It's going to be the investment management arm of the family. So that's the purpose of the affiliate language, is to let us have a fairly complex structure to be able to use those people.
Okay, Representative Byrd had a question first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question has to do with the ancestry rules. I would really like to know what the significant differential is between 2 that's in this document and, let's say, 5 that we used that you used in the Nevada example.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Byrd, my understanding from a policy standpoint, and this might actually be better for Mr. Forkner to address, is that the policy of the Wyoming Division of Banking is to allow private enterprise to obtain this charter. We already have a public trust company charter where you can go and get a license and you can serve as trustee to anybody under the sun in the world. That's what Ms. Hayes' company, the Will Street Group, is. They can serve anyone in the world. The client for the state and for people like me is the family that doesn't want to use a third party. They want to do their own investment management, have their own people in their offices. They want to not be regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission, and they want to pick the state which is going to be their regulator.
You have a follow-up, Representative Byrd?
Yes, Mr. Chair. I'm still not addressing the differential between 2 and 5. At least I'm not understanding where you just went with that.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, Representative Byrd, if a client came to me and said, I have clients from 5 family lines, I would like a license to be a trustee, I would say then fill out the application to become a public trust company under Wyoming law. We have the solution for that. The 1 to 2 solves the problem when this modern quote-unquote family has some element to it that we can't tuck under the single family rule, which is going to cause that family to either go choose the SEC to regulate them, likely not, more likely to pick some competitor jurisdiction to ours like South Dakota, New Hampshire, Florida.
Representative Ayer, you had a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think you just answered my question partially, but I was just wondering if you could just, in very general terms, describe the advantages of a family trust. And you also have a chartered family trust and a private family trust company. Could you kind of explain the differences and the advantages of each of those?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Ayer, a public trust company obtains a charter just like a bank has the ability to serve the public. So that's what we call the public trust company. A chartered family trust company is a relatively new idea that was originated by the states in response to the Dodd-Frank Act. So the Dodd-Frank Act created the single family office exemption from what it means to be a regulated investment advisor. The old rule used to be that if you had 15 or fewer clients, you didn't have to go get regulated. And so a single family, they could have 15 family lines, a single family under the old rule. And then Dodd-Frank absolutely cramped down on that and said, we're not, you have to be a strict single family to avoid registration with the SEC. The states, in response to that, including Wyoming, offered this new thing, called a single family chartered trust company in a direct response to the Dodd-Frank change to the definition of RIA. A unregulated private trust company is a different thing. It usually doesn't have an SEC element. So it would be, for whatever reason, a person wants to serve in a fiduciary capacity, but they don't want to do it individually. Like me as a lawyer, if I have a client that says, oh, Chris, we really want you to be the trustee for our family. We want to pay you all this money and forget your partners. That gives us a solution to say, you know, I can't do it personally for a couple of different reasons, liability being one of the main ones. But I can create this company that, as long as I only serve you and I don't hold myself out to the public at large, I can be your trustee through that entity. There's usually never a securities element to that structure. It's usually a private relationship that it's not being used to basically avoid regulation by the feds.
Yeah, we're on a discussion on the motion, which prompted some good questions, so nothing wrong with that. Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two questions. The first one, going back to the discussion that Senator Clayton had regarding this 35 members or potential members of the key employee group. I guess my question would be, if you imagine a scenario where it's only 3 real family members and 35 key employees, so we're just taking an extreme circumstance that's possible, as this is written. Is there any downside to that, any concern? Could anything bad happen if these aren't family members? I guess that's one thing I would like thought through. It doesn't have to be answered now, but that's the type of unintended consequence that I would like to understand, and I think that's the concern that the chairman has. And I'll offer you the opportunity to comment if you have any at this time.
Yeah, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, if that scenario occurred where I had 3 family members and 35 other members of the general public, I wouldn't even go down the road of suggesting they seek a charter for the single family solution. I would say you want to either just go become a registered investment advisor with the SEC, which would simply solve it simply, or if you really want Wyoming involved, then become a fully licensed public trust company that has no limit on who you can serve.
Right. Mr. Chairman, that's the thing, this is my advice. What I'm looking for is the unintended consequences where the 3 individuals and the 35 decide that they're actually advantaged for doing that and exploiting some potential loophole of the law. I want to know if that is a possibility. And again, I don't know that it is. I don't know that they would gain anything, but that's the consideration. If we create an entirely new entity group, and there are differences to how that group is being treated, that's the Chartered Family Trust Company as a new concept. Is there some way that they could gain that? That's the concern. And again, just something to think through, and it might not be a concern. Mr. Chairman, the other question I have, though, and this is just drafting moving forward, at the top of page 3, when we're looking at, for purposes of this definition, a family trust company may designate. Now, when I look at the definition for family trust company, that includes, as I understand it, private, public, and chartered. Private is not regulated. So, by the definitions, I find that a little bit confusing. Is this supposed to mean at the top of page 3, a chartered family trust company may designate, or is it a public and thereby potentially chartered family trust company? I want to make sure that we're getting the right phrases throughout the new language so that there is clarity for those that are just doing the private family trust company, which is not supposed to be regulated.
Can you remember the first question, or do you want to take the second question first?
If I could take the second question first, please. Chairman Greer, I will have to look at that, but it's the intent is so that this 35 key employee ability would only come into play with respect to a chartered family trust company, not a public trust company or a unregulated private trust company.
So, and members of the committee, remember, this task force does not draft legislation. They're giving us suggestions for amendments. We order the drafting of legislation and we work it. So just keep that in mind as we're here today. Okay. With no further discussion, the question being called by Representative Lindholm. So the motion, if I recall correctly, yes, was to request a bill draft from LSO that followed these amendments, and I'll make some comments if the motion passes after that. So all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay, motion passes. What I would like to do, and I have not had a chance to talk with this with Mr. Co-Chair, but I'd like maybe a subcommittee to ride herd on this just a little bit because it is a complex issue, so that they can be a go-between with LSO, maybe the working group, also make sure that the trust group or committee with the Bankers Association are all communicated. So my first question is I would ask for volunteers for the subcommittee. Okay, so okay, I'm looking for a volunteer. Now I'll take a question. Do you have a question on the subcommittee? We did. Yes. Okay, so back, I had, who was volunteering for the, so I had Senator Rothfuss and so you had Senator Rothfuss, Senator Von Flateren, House guys? Representative Laux, thank you very much. Okay. What's up? Do you want to do it, Representative Laux? Okay, I'm going to have Representative Laux do that, you bet. So we'll discuss just a little bit, but as we get that bill draft worked out, we'll try to make sure we can get that as a version out as quickly as we can, and we'll work from there. So thank you. Again, we've already made several policy decisions 6-7 years ago about the private trust companies. Now we're looking at these amendments and focusing on the cleanup and what this, the significant policy issues are on that. So, okay. All right, thank you. Do you want to take a quick break before we hit the next issue? Our last one for the day. Yep, Energy Authority. I hear Senator Anderson requesting a break. So why don't we? All right. Yeah, this take 10-15 minutes real quick, and then we'll get set up to discuss the possibility of the Energy Authority. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will tell you that this is not a reach into great monetary claims or monetary savings to the state. I will tell you that what we're looking at is more of a single board and maybe increased size of the board instead of, at this moment, the Pipeline Authority and the Infrastructure Authority have their own boards. And so we're trying to get this down to maybe only one. The Governor's Energy Initiative has its own, their request was, and the bill that did not pass out of here was to have another board. So that would be 3 boards if anybody was dealing with energy in general, whether it be coal or oil and gas or uranium. You'd have 3 boards that possibly you could be dealing with. So we're trying to cut this down or trying to combine it into what they call the Energy Authority, which because we want to leave them with their bonding, we couldn't call it the Energy Department or the Energy Agency. We wanted to leave the bonding ability of those entities, the Infrastructure Authority and the Pipeline Authority, to still have that. But also we'd like to, in this bill, if we do create it, if this bill does come out of this committee, is we'd like to have some kind of board meeting where it would say that the Pipeline Authority, the Infrastructure Authority is now the Energy Authority, and amongst that would be the School of Energy Resources would be part of it, would be part of meeting at least twice a week, or twice a year, excuse me, twice a year. And at their board meetings, we'd get everybody that's invested in energy together. So we'd have the board of this energy authority, we'd have the EORI, we'd have the School of Energy Resources, we'd have the governor's office, we'd have everybody there as maybe ex officios. They wouldn't necessarily have to be a voting member, but they would at least all sit down together at least twice a year and talk about what's going on, who they're speaking to lately, within means. I mean, there's some economic development issues and some proprietary issues that would never be spoken of or couldn't be spoken of publicly. But at least we'd have everybody at the same table a couple times a year discussing the development of energy in this state. And should somebody not go to the Wyoming Oil and Gas Conservation Commission or some other group and doesn't really know where to go, they could go to this Energy Authority, and you'd have this one-stop energy group that would tell you, you know, you need to go over to SER, you need to go, if you have enhanced oil recovery issues, you need to go see these people. They would be the one-stop that you would go to, that you would get all the information you need to move on. Hopefully, most companies that do come to the state are familiar with what they need to do, but this would be one place that somebody, and we have an example right here in Campbell County that a coal drying company has come in, basically another coal drying company. But anyway, they've come in and asked a few questions, and they went to the governor's office at one time. They went to, I think, Infrastructure Authority at one time. They went to several different offices before they finally moved their equipment up here, and let's see if they get the next step done. So I'm hoping the board, with everyone involved in this Energy Authority board meetings, is at least talking and meeting at least a couple times a year. So that's my thoughts of how this bill should run, and I will leave it up to the Infrastructure Authority and the Pipeline Authority to give their side.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the explanation, and I'll just echo a little bit on this. Is this concept? Make sure we're not on fire. This concept's nothing new. I read a report, was done several years ago. It was called the Energy Commission. They put down and had a series of recommendations, not dissimilar to the discussion that I hope that we have today in terms of, you know, what can Wyoming do in terms of energy promotion, innovation, technology, assistance with the programs that we put in place, and what can we do and what can we do better. I know oftentimes a lot of the different authorities, commissions, things that have been developed or came up because of a specific need, quite frankly, because the legislatures in the past say, here's a need, here's a problem, we're trying to solve it. This is how we solve it, by passing legislation. The question is now, do we need to look at that, and is it something that we can do better? And Senator Von Flateren made some very good points. And so with that, I think most of the people we've got listed to present can understand what we're looking for. And Mr. Beggar, you're first up on the list. I don't think we did it alphabetically, but
all right.
In any event, you're first, sir.
Mr. Chairman, glad to be back in front of you. So what my plan here today is to sort of just walk through a little bit of who we are and our philosophy moving forward, and give you a sense of our capabilities as you think about how we want to move forward. A couple quick introductions is Mark Stege, chairman of our board, is here back in the corner. And then Sarah Young, who's on our staff, is here as well. So the Infrastructure Authority was created in 2004, and the original sort of project-specific reason for creating that was the development of interstate transmission lines. You know, the thought was move Wyoming energy by wire. The $1 billion bonding authority was created to help assist and help finance projects, but the whole concept was to promote and develop projects to ensure the long-term value of Wyoming's natural resources. Focus on these commercial and pilot scale projects. We do things where in the past we've commissioned studies, provide consulting services to various companies that come in and are interested in how to navigate the Wyoming process, who do they need to talk to, et cetera. Education's a huge part of what we do, explaining how the grid works. Most people don't understand the difference between a regulated utility and a, co-op, municipal type. Different rules, different business mode, those types of things. Don't understand that Wyoming is not in an organized grid. So why they can do things in Iowa are very different than how we do things in Wyoming just because of that. So trying to explain very complicated energy and electrical issues, part of what we do. Mentioned the $1 billion bonding authority. We currently do have one active bond. I believe it was issued in 2006 to help Basin Electric build a fairly short transmission line as a part of the Dry Fork Station build out. That bond, I think, will mature in 2022, if I believe. So that is out there. Number of you have participated in our biannual energy conferences. Last fall, we had one in Jackson dealing specifically with financing and project financing. And the highlight of that conference was a gentleman by the name of Matt Rogers, who was the inventor of the Nest thermostats. And so when he sold Nest to Google and made his billions, his sort of passion now is funding low carbon technology. So that Carbon Recycling Labs initiative that I mentioned this morning, he is the major benefactor of that. And so he came out and talked about how in the high-tech world they view innovation and what Wyoming can do to move things forward. And we had a number of panels talking about financing. And then just a few weeks ago, actually more like 2 months ago, we had one in Laramie, and I know Chairman Greer helped lead a panel discussion there. But the topic for that particular conference was these major transmission issues. We've got the Anschutz project that's moving forward. Rocky Mountain Power is trying to move their gateway forward. Chairman Russell with the PSC brought in a couple grid operators to talk about how their expansion plans and things are going. So, we cover a diverse set of topics, but we do that a couple times a year. And then also, transmission line development, but also these clean coal R&D, ITCs, major example there. And then coal export terminals is also on our portfolio.
Yeah, Representative Gray, sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Beggar, I want to ask you about the coal export terminal item. I think it's really pivotal, and I'm not sure, this is editorial, I'm not sure it's gotten as much focus as it should. So I just want to understand from 2014 when it became part of your portfolio, I'm talking broadly, not just in your department, but I think it's just so important. What has been, and I'd like to chat with you a little bit too on this, after the committee, but what has been the experience since 2014? Can you give like a 30,000 feet up view? Because, you know, I'd like to kind of know the infrastructure authority's experience with the coal export terminal.
Sure. Mr. Chairman, Representative Gray. So, I guess full disclosure, before I took this job, I worked for Cloud Peak Energy in Rio Tinto, which is a major coal export company, and so I do have experience and background with the economics and what they're doing. One of our board members is Ken Miller, who is the retired CEO of the Millennium Bulk Project. And so we have a lot of insight into that particular project. It was shortly after I came on board, we took a group of legislators, I believe it was at the time Speaker Lovenow, Senate President Nicholas, Representative Blake, I don't know, Representative Byrd, I don't know if you were on that tour or not, but we flew out to Portland, went up to the Millennium Project, then went up to Seattle and met with some port developers there as well. So that was a pretty good Wyoming delegation that went out to push those things along. But I think what everybody recognized, and Ken Miller, my board, fully admits, he goes, this thing was going to be settled in the courts. You know, because if there was if they gave the approval to build the port, the environmental NGOs were going to sue. But we got just the exact opposite, where they didn't approve the port, and so now the developers are suing. So this is just really uncharted territory, and I don't know if there was a specific legislative, regulatory thing that we could do, because the current political leadership in Washington was so politically opposed to coal that any chance that they could, in their analysis, when they were able to make a subjective determination, it was going to be anti-coal. Those developers recognized that. And so as they were going through their environmental permitting process, they tried to do everything above and beyond. You need 2 studies on whatever, we're going to do 3. You know, this paper trail, all of these things were done in anticipation that it was going to be litigated. So that's currently where we are today. Yesterday, so there was a lawsuit in federal district court out in Washington saying the Washington Department of Ecology and appropriate other state agencies didn't follow their own process and procedure in rejecting this port project. So we are suing Governor Inslee, Department of Ecology. All of these people are named parties to this lawsuit, saying that it should be overturned and they should apply a different standard. The state of Washington, not surprisingly, put in a motion to have that case dismissed. Yesterday, federal district court judge ruled that that lawsuit could proceed. And that is the same lawsuit that the Attorney General's and Governor Meade's office weighed in on Commerce Clause issues. And we've also seen a number of states, agriculture-based states, join in support of the lawsuit, because the question at hand is, can one state arbitrarily deny a product that they are opposed to? And so you see these ag states like Kansas and South Dakota coming on board, because going, well, we raise a lot of GMO corn, and we want to ship that corn and those GMO ag commodities. And so if Washington sets the standard that we can approve or deny something because we don't like it, we could be next. So it's really multifaceted and a lot of different things coming together, but I think ultimately we felt that it was going to go to the courts.
All right. Yeah, that's okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Beggert, so I'd be curious on some of your comments on, I mean, you used the we a couple times. I mean, I assume you're talking about your previous role, because the state of Wyoming, while we filed this amicus brief, and we're not a party on the lawsuit, which in my mind is a huge strategic error, because the way, when a state sues another state, it's handled differently by the federal courts, just constitutionally, but also the precedence that it is given in the federal court. Once a ruling is made, you know, it's going to be very difficult to undo that. So I think for the state of Wyoming not to be suing here, I think is a huge strategic error, or, you know, with other states. So that's my view. So could you comment a little bit on that and your opinion on that?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Gray, litigation lawsuits the domain of the governor and the attorney general's office. I mean, the infrastructure authority is 2 people. Our annual budget's roughly $650,000. You know, we're just, the governor has made it very clear that litigation will be run through there. So, and being a non-attorney, I guess I probably don't have enough understanding of the process and, you know, things to make a really super informed decision there. Certainly follow the lead of the governor. And when I say we, I'm talking about Wyoming coal industry. You know, it's a very 30,000-foot collective we, not a particular company.
One more follow-up.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Beggar, so the motion yesterday that was ruled that the suit can proceed, was that a standing challenge? I mean, what was the motion that the state of Washington filed? What was the nature of the motion?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Gray, the issue at hand was the state of Washington's motion to dismiss the case. And I believe what they felt was at hand is that the state processes haven't completely run their course. And so to bring this federal suit at this time was premature. The judge did agree with that in some respects, but did feel like there was a compelling enough argument to continue at this time.
Yep, thank you. Just let's go ahead and move along.
All right. On sort of the slide called Evolving Mission, you know, what we're talking about today isn't entirely inconsistent with what WIA has done in the past. Our mission has evolved significantly and multiple times since 2004. You know, we started with transmission lines. 2006 became Advanced Energy Technologies. 2014 was coal distribution facilities, exports. 2015, the governor asked us to be the lead on the integrated test center. 2017, governor asked us to be the lead on this multinational, multi-state CCUS MOU. Just this year during the legislature and the budget bill, there was language that asked us to carry out an oil and gas severance tax study and an energy strategy study. So, you know, over time, it's been the prerogative of the legislature, and you do what you do. I mean, we carry it out, and we've, you know, we're not uncomfortable with that evolving mission. And it's
Representative Byrd.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Director Beggar. You just mentioned that you have a limited budget and 2 people, and you just gave a litany of tasks that would basically make any large agency busy. How do you manage to do this? Maybe we should stamp this out for the other agencies.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Byrd, it just comes down to prioritization of issues and where we can bring in contract people and resources that's available. You know, the $21 million for the ITC, for example, within that statute, it's for planning, construction, operations, maintenance, and certainly within the purview of that is to bring in contract people to help us with certain aspects. So as that project has come together and we have a better clarity, we bring in certain experts. We have a young guy who's a PhD in chemical engineering, and he consults on power plant projects all over the world, but his dissertation was on oxy-fired CO2 capture. And so he's the kind of guy that can look at a project and go, yeah, that's just, science doesn't work, the chemistry, I can't do that. Our board is extremely active. 2 weeks ago when we did the dedication and we had J. Cole and that 7-member Japanese delegation in, one of my board members went with me at the airport at 11:30 at night to pick those guys up and chauffeured them around all week. You know, our board chairman's here today. You know, very active, very supportive. We lean on our industry partners to provide information. You know, no reason to reinvent the wheel if there's good information there. But I also think one of the things, you know, personally, coming from private sector, coming into this job, is the private sector acts pretty decisively and pretty quickly, and we don't like to beleaguer decisions. You know, taking all the information that you can, do your risk assessment, and when you think that you're comfortable enough to pull the trigger on something, pull the trigger on something. You know, and be confident in your decision and be able to defend it if you need to. So we are just 2 people, you know. We try our best to only work 8 to 5. We travel a lot, but it is a lot of fun. And And we do accomplish a lot of things, but we have a lot of people who do help us as well. Kind of along those lines, as I was preparing this this presentation, I have a great relationship with the Minerals Committee and have done a lot of activities with you all. But, you're aware of the ITC, some of our stuff on coal exports, but we do all those various things that, Representative Byrd mentioned. And it was just on last Tuesday when I was pulling this together, I thought, okay, there's probably no better way to describe all the different things that we were working on at a given time than last Tuesday. So I just documented sort of what my day looked like for that. It's everything from a multi-state legislative tour with guys from Arkansas, Texas, Kansas, and Missouri coming in July to look at ITC and power plants, to talking with congressional staff in D.C., to talking to our external audit, which is going to start quickly, reviewing the RFPs for that oil and gas study. We're just juggling a lot of different things, and that's just the nature of what we have going on right now. So kind of clicking to the next slide, there's our philosophy. With only 2 people, the budget that we have, we're not going to be a project developer. When you're talking a multi-billion-dollar transmission line, that's not going to be us that does that. But, what is this philosophy? And so, we think in order to have a successful project, you need 3 things. A project needs to be economical, or needs to show that glide path to economic feasibility. It needs to be feasible. And what I mean by that, the technology needs to work, and it needs to be able to be permittable. If you can't get a permit for something, that's not feasible. And if it doesn't work, also not feasible. And it also needs to be politically viable. And I think this is something that a lot of people don't fully consider in project development. When you look at, like the protests in North Dakota with Dakota Access, that wasn't a project feasibility or an economics thing. That was a political problem. And it almost derailed it. Keystone Pipeline is another example of it was a politics that derailed that. And so when we look at where we can be the most impactful in moving these things forward, we feel like that advocacy and helping political viability is a proper and important role for us to play. Our communications and public outreach. This morning when we talked to ITC, the handout about all the activities we did with that, I think that's a really good example of how we approach these things. Business development, trying to help companies understand the economics of certain things. As I mentioned, the grid, the electrical system in Wyoming is very different. Coal economics, especially when you're referring to export sales and that transportation component, it's very different than what most people think. So can we help provide some clarity there? Being a resource for elected officials. Senator Brasso's staff and Travis this morning talked about the Use It Act. We were heavily involved with the senator's EPW committee staff in drafting that language with the idea of can we help formulate language that would be the most beneficial to Wyoming and specifically the ITC. Also legislators. A lot of you have reached out to us at times for various information and try to be that resource. Same way with the governor's office. He's tapped us to be the lead on MOUs and ITC, that sort of thing. Also be a resource for companies. Co-chairman Von Flatern mentioned Clean Coal Technologies, which is a coal drying company. They came to us. I know that they had conversations with others, but we sat down with them, heard what their needs were, and said, actually, you know what? We need to drive up to Gillette. You need to meet the local economic development authority, the mayor, those folks up there. We brought them up there, made that relationship, handed them off, and then they made the announcement that they're moving up actually on the Economic Development Authority's land. So, we see that as a great example of it wasn't a good fit for us, but we knew who you needed to talk to, and so we handed them off. And then again, just these timely response times, eliminate that decision paralysis, regardless of what you think of our president and what's going on in Washington, D.C., he has been very supportive of coal and, trying to move things forward. And so we have, 2.5 years of this administration. We don't know what we're going to get next, but let's use these 2.5 years to move things forward, push things as fast as you can, I've heard Chairman Gurr say, put that stake in the ground. So let's do that and try to get as much accomplished as we can while we have the administration we do. The next slide here on philosophy is, looking at that holistic approach when it's, policy development and implementation. We've been a part of National Rural Electric Cooperatives. They've asked us to participate in meetings, quarterly meetings that they have with the Department of Energy. And we've said, what you need to, or what we would really like to see is a proactive look at carbon management technologies. Not just the capturing, but what you do with it. And a couple of weeks ago, DOE issued an FOA on carbon utilization, and that language looks very, very similar to what we provided them in December. So, trying to be very forward-thinking and pushing things out to those decision makers. Again, with the Use It Act, we were a part of that. Matt Fry with the Governor's Office was a part of that. Dr. Northam with UW-SER, Kip Coddington. So, what can we do to, push Wyoming's priorities? And then looking then again at project development. We went down to Petra Nova. A number of you on the committee were able to go along on that trip. But I think you were able to see firsthand that a major project like that isn't just the technology. You also got the pipelines, you got the oil fields, you have financing. These things are very multifaceted, and especially with the Petra Nova project, it's so unique in so many ways that it might be very difficult, if not impossible, to replicate. But continual coordination with these various entities. We talked with UW-SER and Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute and all these entities quite often to figure out how we can work together and rely on each other's strengths to move things forward. Kind of lastly, we want to talk about some of our outreach activities. This morning you saw specifically the ITC dedication, that rollout. In April, there was the X Prize finalist announcement. That was in New York. That was X Prize operated and run, but we were able to sort of step in and help be a part of that. The trip that we took down to Petra Nova and Net Power, certainly important to see how projects are coming together and make some connections there. Last year we did a tour for Arkansas legislators to come up and look. Arkansas, I believe last year was the 4th largest consumer of Wyoming coal. So bringing up I think it's their utilities committee members to understand and see this as they go back home and make decisions with regards to how they're going to manage their utility industry in those states. And so these customer states are really important because we can mine all the coal we want in Wyoming, but if we don't have legislators and decision makers in these consuming states that support those policies, it doesn't matter. So we had extraordinary interest in that tour, and actually about 2 weeks ago I had to cap it just because I'm booked. We just can't take on any more. We'll put you on the name for next year. But I guess it'll be the second week in July, we have 5 Arkansas legislators, 4 from Texas, 5 from Missouri, and 2 from Kansas that will be coming up here to look at ITC. We'll take them down to North Antelope Rochelle, take them out to Wyodak. Last year, Representative Barlow and Senator Driscoll hosted them at their respective ranches. They're going to do that again. Pretty quick meeting, but what can we do to really highlight and showcase what we've got in the state that they can hopefully go home and say, okay, everything we were told about coal mines is wrong. Everything we've been told about new power plants is wrong. And there's really good examples in Wyoming, so we can feel confident in keeping coal as a part of our portfolio. I've testified before U.S. Senate EPW Committee on Use It Act. I'm slated to testify before House Sciences Committee probably this fall. I've given countless ITC presentations. I can talk about that in my sleep. One really unique thing, and it was just an opportunity to get out there and talk about it in a different way to a different audience, is we gave a TEDx talk in Cheyenne on, I shouldn't say we did, I gave a TEDx talk. in Cheyenne on the ITC and our philosophy and how we did things and structured that to make that a reality. There's nothing more nerve-wracking than stepping on stage with no notes to give a 15-minute talk and knowing that everything's sort of built on whatever, and if you misstepped one, you could just come crashing down. So that was interesting. I've done podcasts with the Cheyenne Star Tribune and NPR on various energy things. A couple things I don't have on the list but are worth mentioning is social media. We've got a couple different social media accounts to push various topics. One is Stay Strong Wyoming, and that is specifically targeting or pushes coal export related issues. The other one is Wyoming Wind to talk about wind and transmission issues. And we've also done a number of letters of support for various projects as they are trying to get through different aspects of their permits.
Representative Byrd, we'll let Mr. Beggar take a deep breath. He had a question.
Thank you. In your fire hose presentation here, which is quite fascinating, I don't think I heard, or maybe you haven't got to it, is we're really dwelling on the existing technologies, burning coal, capturing, which are all things we need to be focused on. Mm-hmm. But what about the extension of the ITC? Where do we go with that resource in the ground and developing new markets for it, like post-processing into synfuels and things like that? Is that inside your basket of goods, or is that you'd like to get to it because you don't have enough people?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Byrd, I think it's more of the latter. It's certainly, advanced coal energy technologies is broad. You can really put things in it. But with the resources that we have, we've been really focused on ITC and, specifically that project. But, I know the university is doing some really cool things with that. Certainly Business Council and Dow looking at expanding those markets. And, given the resources that we have and have as a state, as a whole, we try to tap into and hand off various things as it is appropriate. So when the carbon recycling labs guy came in, and I know he's the one who gave the presentation during the session, one of the first meetings that we had that day was with, Jeremiah Riemann, Sean Reese, a couple of members, I think Matt Kaufman was there with the Endow board saying, as we're talking this broader economic diversification thing, this really is in the wheelhouse of Endow, and we will support how we can, but sort of trying to just hand that off.
Yeah. Representative Bridge, you have a follow-up, and then I just also for the committee again, we are, and it's good. We're going to have all the agencies or authorities, quasi-agencies, speak to their mission, but we're also want to explore the opportunity of the Energy Authority. So, Representative Byrd, go ahead with your follow-up.
Well, thank you. To follow up on that, so my point here is that we have this resource, and you're really dedicated to that. So should it be this group on this side of the dais that are pushing those other agencies, or maybe expanding your footprint with more staff and people so you can explore or go out and actually vet these new technologies so we can start to look at them and start to bring those online, or should we be focusing on the other? Tell me what you need so we can go to the next step. So our goal is not just looking at existing, ignition technologies and where we're at right now. I want to see synfuel plants and all the next level technology that we can leverage out of this coal for the next 50 years. So why don't you tell me what you need and what your associated agencies need?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Greer, certainly if we had more resources, we could venture into a lot of different avenues. Like you said, synfuels, coal to products, coal to, whatever, carbon fiber, but again, I think our greatest, one of our great partnerships is with the university, and we don't want to duplicate what is being done elsewhere. And the actual hardcore R&D is the domain of the university. So there's kind of some gray area in between, but where we try to do, or what we really try to focus on, is how do we take those great technologies that seem to have the most commercial merit and link them with the appropriate people to make a project a reality. So this morning when I was speaking and Director Carpenter was talking about needing a champion, well, I think one of the roles we try to play in Wyoming is trying to find that champion. You know, whether that's the CEO of Basin Electric, Paul Sukit, who is, you know, have had his company devote incredible resources to the ITC. You know, maybe that's, we pull something together, a project together, and take it to him and say, you know, does this fit within your domain, and can we make this happen? So, you know, certainly more resources would allow us to do more things, but I do fully appreciate and understand the financial situation of the state. And my understanding of that this discussion today is specifically looking at, okay, we can't create a new department, a new entity, a standalone on top of what we already have, but can we achieve those goals by creating and you know, reshuffling the deck chairs in a way that better aligns with our needs of today as opposed to years ago when these different entities were created. Because, you know, in order to move these projects forward, you do need that critical mass.
Okay. Any questions? Yeah, for Mr. Baker. Go ahead, Senator.
Do you think, Mr. Chairman, do you think a larger organization would give you more resources, or would it just bog you down in bureaucracy and you not have the flexibility to be able to do all the things that you're talking about doing?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Anderson, there are certainly pros and cons to larger organizations. You know, and my official position on this is legislature sets the policy, we will carry it out. You know, one of the cons of that is, yeah, you could create a larger organization with more administrative headaches and burdens, but I think the key would be how do you do something, you know, and then the great advantage of an authority is we can operate like a private business under sort of the mantle of the government. So one thing that we can do is we can kind of sole source contract. We're not beholden to the same procurement rules. We can move fairly quickly. So if we need to find a specific person to do something, we can make that happen fairly quickly. So I would hope that whatever this thing could eventually look like, it comes to fruition, that is the sort of the philosophy moving forward. You know, let's focus on projects. You know, one of the benefits would be if you have, you know, different projects in different industries go through cycles over time. You know, where it's really slow with oil, but it's really happening with CO2 pipelines. You know, can you sort of divert resources towards what's happening? You still have the other things on your portfolio, but then when it swings back, you sort of go back and swing back that way. You know, hopefully you wouldn't have people sitting idle just because oil's at $45 a barrel and nobody's really doing much. You know, I think that would be a benefit. But at the end of the day, legislature created us. You can take us away. I mean, we will push forth with, you know, however you choose to proceed. So.
Okay, I've just got a couple questions I'll probably ask in some form of everyone that testifies. But again, so could you just give us the size of your board, the expertise of your board, and just briefly, you don't have to go through every board member. Just
I have 5 board members. Predominantly utility industry folks. 2 from utilities, 1 retired coal exec. He was the port executive. 1 who's the head of Western Research Institute in Laramie, and then another one who has a background in transportation consulting.
Okay. And Dan, I also just kind of wanted to know, in terms of, you know, we look at the different, you know, authorities or quasi-agencies, things that we've set up around the state regarding energy. What duplication do you see that's out there where we have 2 people following, or 2 groups following the same path? Is there much of that going on, or is there good coordination?
Mr. Chairman, I think there's pretty good coordination. You know, I talk with SER, the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute, Carbon Management Institute, but that is more personality-based, where all of us do talk and communicate, but there's nothing mandating that we specifically work together. And as we move forward with projects, sometimes you do have to just sort of catch yourself going, well, I'm kind of getting down this path. And, Director Coddington's guys are actually working on this, and we don't need to spend the time. We can just give them a call. And so, that's a little bit more self-regulated. When I came on board, really coincided with the first sort of drastic budget cuts. And it forced us to take a really close look in the mirror and go, okay, what are we duplicating? What can we do without? What is better left to somebody else? And I think we've done a good job of kind of weeding that stuff out and becoming a leaner operation.
And then a final question then is, what gaps are existing? One that comes to mind I see right now is dealing with wind energy.
Mm-hmm.
We just don't have anything out there. We have wind. Mm-hmm. We have federal tax credits. We have investors are there, but nothing that's working in that particular area. So what other gaps might be existing?
Mr. Chairman, you're right. Wind energy is not within our organic statute. We end up sort of doing a lot of wind because wind is associated with these new transmission projects, and you sort of won't have one without the other. But wind is definitely something that we don't have. I think another area is, or it might be more of an area of confusion, is this, unlike all of our other surrounding states, and we've tried to do a little bit of analysis to understand how different states accomplish the things we're talking about today. We are one of the only states that doesn't have like a centralized energy policy office or an energy office. And so it's one thing I've heard more than once is, as a new developer or somebody coming in the state, we really don't know who to go to. The Business Council, their mission is helping set businesses up, but they don't have a particular energy expertise. SER is very research oriented, as a university should be. The state does have a state energy office within the Business Council, but they only manage energy efficiency grants through the Department of Energy. So it can be confusing to understand who do you need to go to and who can help be that clearinghouse for, okay, you need to talk to so-and-so, or oh, you have an air permit, we can get you, air administration division at DEQ is who you need to talk to, or whoever. So that is a gap. I think we have all the pieces in place, but they're not necessarily formally coordinated.
Okay. Committee, any further questions? I'm going to try to move us along here just a little bit. So, Mr. Beggar, thank you. Mr. Jeffries, I think we have you up next, sir.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. So I will quickly run through what the Pipeline Authority's mission is and the tasks that we're doing. We provided a lot of material ahead of time. I'm not going to go through that slide by slide. If there's questions that have arisen in committee members' minds from what they've read, I can certainly refer to it at that point. So the Wyoming Pipeline Authority exists because the state of Wyoming has tremendous exposure to infrastructure to move its oil and gas to market. The state currently produces roughly 5 billion cubic feet per day of gas. 95% of that is consumed out of state and moves out of state. So you have exposure to the pipelines to get it out, the rules and terms and conditions of pipelines, as well as the market demand on the other end of those pipelines. So that task is a commercially driven logic for the Pipeline Authority. What sort of things can we do that change the value of gas or oil produced in Wyoming? Because the price of gas, the price of oil goes straight back to taxable value and tax revenues. And that's the reason the Pipeline Authority has always existed. So 3 main areas that we focus our time. First is on maintaining the database of the pipelines within the state. It's hard to assess what you need to do if you don't know what you have. So there are approximately 100 companies operating 30,000 miles of pipeline in our database, and that database is constantly updated with new pipelines, changes in ownership of pipelines, nature of operation. They change sometimes from crude oil to gas service, back to gas, et cetera. We get that information from public sources. We get it from voluntary submissions. And on one notable case, directly from a member of the legislature who literally has an oil pipeline in his backyard that we were not aware of. And it's in the database now. So that activity of maintaining the database and the quality of the database, we are the expert source for that portion of the state's mapping system that incorporates all the different elements that go into the next, what's the next tag? You've got a representative of that part of the mapping process later in this panel that'll do a better job of explaining the name and how they do it. But keeping track of the data and making sure that the quality of the data is accurate so that it's not something that merely makes pretty maps but is actually accurate is the responsibility. We maintain that on a publicly available website. Our information feeds to other state agencies and to their websites. Protecting that database is part of the work that we do. According to our information specialists that work in our organization, we average 136 attempts a day to inappropriately access the database and potentially manipulate it or damage it. So securing the data as well is part of the process. The second thing we do, I referenced that 90+% of the gas in Wyoming is consumed out of state. There are 14 interstate pipelines that operate in Wyoming that are under the jurisdiction of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the FERC. The rates charged by those pipelines and the terms and conditions, including the quality specifications on those pipelines, all affect the value of gas in Wyoming. Now, you think about it, the cost to get it there and whether it's allowed to flow to markets based on quality issues all affect your access to market. We have a notable example last year in the Powder River Basin. There was a pipeline company that came up for a rate case before the FERC. The Pipeline Authority intervened, and that's a step we take. You have to intervene in a pipeline docket to have standing throughout the process. If you miss those intervention windows, you can make comments, but your comments will not be part of the official record, and you won't have the ability to participate in subsequent appeals. We identify those. We get involved. The one out of the Powder River Basin involved a pipeline who had been requested or actually ordered by the FERC to demonstrate that its rates were fair and reasonable. As typically is the case, those type of rate cases lead to settlement discussions between the shipper parties, the pipeline, and the FERC trial staff. Because we intervened, we were in that group of settling parties. We identified that the proposed initial settlement terms to freeze the rates through August of 2019 would leave Powder River Basin producers exposed to substantial increases in rate after that date. We were able to push out that rate freeze because we were the only party at that point that identified the issue, push that rate freeze out to August of 2021. Depending upon what the rates turn out to be in the next rate case, that 17-month interval will save producers between $14 and $134 million in extra transportation costs. The royalty and tax impact of the state of that savings is roughly $2 to $12 million, depending on how the rates turn out. The reason for that is the pipeline's rates were predicated upon the volumes that moved on that pipeline during the Powder River Basin's heyday for coal bed methane. The contracts that were established at that time run out in August of 2019, and that's why the pipeline picked that date for its rate freeze to go off. With a new and lower contractual commitment to the pipeline, you'll take the same costs of the pipeline and divide it by fewer units, and your rate will go up. So that's what we recognized and dealt with. So for the 14 pipelines that operate out of Wyoming, they filed roughly 1,100 filings with the FERC last year. And there's probably 45 of those that have some relevance in terms of effect on rates or contain information that we're interested in. And typically in a year, there's one or two that really matter, and we intervene and become involved. We sift through that 1,100 filings without using outside consultants or outside attorneys because we have the commercial and regulatory background to know that 99.9% of those are routine and can be ignored, but we know which ones to ignore. So we do, I think, an outstanding job of sifting relevance for the state of Wyoming in something that has such an impact on the state of Wyoming. The third thing we do is foster demand. That's both in-state and outside the state. An example of outside the state is the Jordan Cove liquefied natural gas facility proposed for the coast of Oregon. Wyoming has an advantaged position for access to that facility if it's built. That facility would require 1 billion cubic feet per day of gas. To put that in perspective, the states of Washington, Oregon, and California on an average day basis consume 8 billion cubic feet per day of gas. So that's a 12.5% increase in market demand in a location where we have at least an equal and I think better than average shot at being a supplier. And even if someone else captures that market in the West, they've deserted some other market. So, if Canadian gas serves that facility, then that same quantity of Canadian gas is not serving California, and we can take over that market. So an increase in market of 12.5% is always a good thing. With respect to in-state, as an example of cooperating with other agencies, the Wyoming Business Council was approached by a party who wanted to build a specialty chemical plant outside Cheyenne. It was the name of the entity was Standard Alcohol. They make a variety of boutique alcohols that go into a refining process. So they wanted to build a site or consider building a site in Wyoming, and they were looking at the Swan Ranch facility outside Cheyenne. They approached the Business Council about it. They had questions about access to natural gas supply. The Business Council immediately referred them to the Pipeline Authority. We sat down with Standard Alcohol and walked them through the 6 different pipeline choices available to them at that site, the characteristics of the pipelines as to minor differences in gas quality between the pipes, which if you're using gas for feedstock matters. It doesn't matter if you're burning it. It matters if you can use it for a feedstock. Walk them through how the pricing differed on the 6 different pipelines relative to a common price at the Cheyenne trading hub nearby. Gave them the, it's only a few pennies difference between this pipeline or that, but it's part of your process costs. We walked them through that. Gave them a rundown on the distance and the likely connection cost to each of the pipelines. And then with their consent and the pipeline's consents, arranged meetings with 4 of the pipelines between this potential demand for gas and the pipeline companies, not to be their negotiating agent, but to be there to sort of translate pipeline speak to customer speak and back and forth, make sure all the right questions got asked. We saved them a lot of time because in setting those meetings up, we can call up the pipeline and we know who to call. We're not calling the main number and winding our way through the company. We know exactly who in business development at that pipeline company is the right person to host this meeting. So we save them a lot of time. If they go forward, the facility will use 7 million cubic feet per day of gas. That's $2.4 billion a year. That will make them a top 10 consumer of gas in Wyoming. The facility would employ on a permanent basis roughly 35 employees. So it's an example of helping someone site in Wyoming. The chairman of Standard Alcohol told me that the information they got from the Wyoming Business Council and the Wyoming Pipeline Authority made the difference in why they stopped pursuing a location in Colorado, because they got nothing close to that sort of technical, regulatory, and market information from any agency in Colorado. So moving to the question of what kind of a board do we have 2 engineers, each who have experience operating gas pipelines, gas processing plants. One is now a member of the Oil and Gas Commission, Ken Hendricks, who used to operate Salt Creek Field for Anadarko, and the associated CO2 pipeline. One of the other engineers, a gentleman named Dave Canini, previously was a vice president for Anadarko and a president for several other gas processing companies, and prior to that was with Western Gas Resources, and where I was previously as well. And we installed over 1 million horsepower in the Powder River Basin and built over $1 billion worth of gas processing plants throughout the West. So very relevant experience to what we do. Other board members include a geologist, a gentleman with a finance background, and a gentleman with legislative background, Bill Hawks, former chairman of the Minerals Committee. So we're able to do what we do based upon the expertise of our board. As to the executive directors that the Pipeline Authority's had in the sort of modern era of the Pipeline Authority, myself and my predecessor have the same background. I'm an engineer. I'm actually licensed as a professional engineer. I started as an engineer for a pipeline company in Houston, and then I moved into the marketing department and have held officer-level positions over marketing and trading of natural gas throughout the United States.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Jeffries, how many total board members? I was a little lost there. I thought it was 6 or 7 or 5 or...
Mr. Chairman, Senator Von Flatter, we have 5.
5, okay. And do you see anything that you've expounded upon that you do as part of your duties? Do you see anything changing if we go to we combine or put you guys in the same office, I should say, the WIA and the WPA, along with the governor's energy strategy, whatever that may amount to?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Von Flatter, the short answer would be no. As Jason suggested, we do the missions that the legislature assigns us to do. And so the things that I've walked through that we do now, if you wish us to continue doing that, then the sort of staff and board makeup that allows us to be responsive to that will need to continue. One item in the question, though, is if we combine offices. We're based in Casper. The Infrastructure Authority is in Cheyenne. If we combine offices, there's always the risk that you will have personnel losses associated with a move. They are a small office. We're a small office. You have a great deal of institutional knowledge embedded in people, and you don't have, we're not a 50-person organization with bench strength, so that if one of our business development people goes away, one of the other 5 will pick up the slack. So I would be concerned about losing staff. You can replace people, but there will be a downstroke while they come up to speed if people don't wish to make a move.
Kind of, Mr. Jeffries, along those lines, and I know one of your staff members real well, and a great gal. As we look or discuss this concept, though, that the idea of just one physical office somewhere is not necessarily the reality of professional work anymore. I mean, you can work remotely, but also looking, and this is just something we see in a lot of organizations, and I fall into this category too anymore, is we're getting older. And on small organizations, it's harder to get that succession plan in place because there's not those other people to move in. And so I don't know if you've given any consideration to that within your particular organization, or if that's a factor, anything to think about.
Mr. Chairman, succession planning is really hard when you are, in our case, a 3 full-time equivalent operation with 4 people. You just can't afford the luxury of carrying people with multiple support roles and still be economical. So from the standpoint of succession planning, it would be more a case of replacement planning for any of the folks in the Pipeline Authority that for whatever reason go off and do something else. The board will be tasked, if they wish to continue the same sorts of tasks, finding someone with the requisite background.
Sure. And I understand the difficulties with that. A couple more questions. I'm just trying to, with the Pipeline Authority, and it's an authority because it had bonding authority to encourage the development of pipelines to export. I think it was natural gas primarily, but oil's not out of the question. And to change that price differential like we would see from gas selling in Wyoming, the Opal hub versus, what we'd see in the Henry hub. And my understanding is that the authority's been extremely successful to get that differential down. And is that a fair statement?
Mr. Chairman, I think it is. When the state of Wyoming embarked on the idea of expanding infrastructure to reduce the differential, at that time, I believe the Rocky Mountain region, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, taken together, who compete for the same access to the same pipes, had pipeline capacity, so we're talking roughly 1990 era, probably capacity of about 2 billion cubic feet per day to move gas out of the region. That capacity is now 10.4 billion cubic feet per day. And that exceeds our demand for export capacity. So we have sufficient capacity in place. The bonding authority allowed the pipeline authority, and this predates me, to have a seat at some very important discussions about getting a particularly large pipeline built to the east, Rockies Express. There was a time when there were 4 or 5 competing projects. Rockies Express was one, Kinder Morgan Advantage, Beacon Pipeline, and a couple others out there, and none of them could get enough commercial support to move forward. They had split the market up, and nobody had critical mass. With the pipeline authority's ability to potentially play a role in financing a pipeline, not that it meant to pick a winner, because the pipeline authority's favorite pipeline is the one that gets built. We were able to, through the pipeline authority and my predecessor, to throw in its lot behind a particular pipeline. The bonding authority gave them the ability to have a legitimate seat at the table, and in a perfectly executed strategy, were able to get out of their obligation for capacity on that pipeline, expend no state funds whatsoever in the building of the pipeline, but yet get the pipeline built, and now it's there to service, and pipelines last 50, 60 plus years. So it's a great story of very adroit negotiation and use of assets, including contractual assets.
Yeah. And I asked that question because we do have a lot of new members who probably didn't understand the full history of the pipeline authority and those success stories, and that bonding authority sort of being as we found a tool in the toolbox to make things happen. So I appreciate you recounting that for us. Yeah, go ahead, Senator Rothfuss. Do you want a representative to help you with that?
Make it go. Oh, you got it. I think. No, you didn't. There we go. I think one of the other things that's kind of important for the committee to understand, and those that haven't become familiar with the pipeline authority, is that relationship and the quasi-governmental. One aspect of it was establishing it as quasi-executive so that we could have the bonding authority. But can you talk a little bit more about the governance and the organizational chart? My understanding, if I recall correctly, is that you report to the board. The board is selected by the governor with review by the Senate, but there is not really a chain of command line drawn. It's not a full executive agency. Can you comment more on that and the nature of the organization? I think that's important to understand, and that's the same as the infrastructure authority, as I understand it.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, your characterization of the agency in terms of its status as a consequence of bonding, and that discussion's occurred earlier, is accurate. That's why it's a quasi sort of entity. We do have a 5-member board that I report to, but we are funded by appropriation from the legislature, and our statutes prohibit us from using legislatively appropriated funds for projects. We would have to raise those independently so as not to run afoul of the Constitution of this, for the state having us fund external works of improvement. As a practical matter, because we are funded by the legislature and our budget is put forth by the governor, Although there's not a line that draws us back to the legislature or the governor's office, where you get your money defines who you work for. So we work for the legislature, and we work in close combination with the governor's office. Examples of things we've started doing in the governor's office: we've dramatically cut our legal costs over the years in terms of using outside attorneys, even though FERC-related work is highly specialized law. It's administrative law and relies upon prior decisions and cases. To cut down on legal expenses for sort of the routine legal efforts like intervention filings, et cetera, we now go through the Attorney General's office, and we get directed there by the governor's office, and our practice is for the Pipeline Authority to write the guts of the filings because they're commercially driven documents, and that's what we're familiar with. Turn it over to the Attorney General's office to clean it up into the proper formatting, and often jointly file as the Pipeline Authority in the state of Wyoming. So it's a coordination we do, and that necessarily means we have to come to the governor's office and explain, why is this particular FERC matter of import? What are the consequences? What do we hope to achieve? And how do we frame our arguments? So the circumstances create give and take to offices.
Okay, go ahead, Sandra.
And regarding the funding, if I recall correctly, the original intent when it was set up the way it was set up was that it wouldn't be on appropriation, that it would be weaned away, and that you develop your own internal funding sources, which there really never was any business model for doing that. I think the original thought was the pipeline. Since you managed to extricate yourself from owning a pipeline, that sort of went away. Is that accurate also?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, that's correct. The plan in the original, and this again predates me and transitioned right when I came on board, was the original funds to the Pipeline Authority were loans, which the intention was the Pipeline Authority would subsequently issue bonds and would have an interest rate vigorish built into that, from which it would generate the funds to pay the loans back. In the absence of issuing bonds and the associated vigorish, there was no income stream. And so at some point, 6 or 7 years ago at least, the legislature realized the reality of that, and loaning money to pay loans and just rolling the stone up the hill was an impractical charade.
I want to just kind of go back to, and this is as I understood it, which I understand things wrongly. So, but the mission was to help. Initially, it was to help get natural gas out of the state of Wyoming, and the Ruby pipeline came on, I think, when I was a new legislator that helped with that tremendously. It sounds as if the mission now is to help by making sure that we're keeping the transportation costs down. Is that a true shift in mission that you've seen in the last few years? Is that a fair statement?
That is a fair statement, Mr. Chairman, and I'd add to it that part of it's protecting access to the pipelines that do exist. As an example, and it's in the packet of materials, there's a pipeline called Northern Natural Gas that starts in the Permian Basin of Texas, and it runs all the way up through Nebraska, the Dakotas, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. It is fed by a pipeline called Trailblazer Pipeline that comes out of the Cheyenne hub. Northern Natural at one point wanted to change its gas quality specification by lowering a particular limit on a constituent or a component of the gas in such a way that for Wyoming gas coming out of the Cheyenne hub and going down the Trailblazer pipeline, it would no longer be compatible with that pipeline. And that would mean that we would either have to add expensive treating to all Wyoming gas to make sure we met the quality spec, or that nearly 1 billion a day capacity pipeline of Trailblazer would no longer be of use to Wyoming as access to the rest of the grid, because you have to meet the lowest common denominator out there on the grid. The Wyoming Pipeline Authority protested that filing by Northern Natural, a pipeline that comes nowhere near the state, but we commercially understand its relevance to the state. Argued strongly, and in one of FERC's most strongly worded orders, rejected that change. And in fact, that case is now a reference case for other pipelines trying to do the same thing. But so it's protecting the access you have as well. Northern Natural had commercial reasons for wanting to do that, to increase the value of transportation up from the Permian Basin, because gas coming from the Permian Basin to Wisconsin generates more rate income than gas entering their system in Nebraska and going to Wisconsin.
Okay. Committee, any further questions? Okay. So in the interest of moving along, which I'm terrible at, I could ask you questions all day. It's, to me, it's good stuff. But no, we'll try to respect the time of our committee here. Next up, we have Colin McKee from the governor's office. And I think, Colin, you were maybe the one that, or at least Governor Meade was one that kicked off sort of this discussion because of the governor's energy policies, and we were trying to look to maybe put something statutorily in place to see some continuity between administrations. And we thought, well, maybe we need more continuity than just energy policy. So if you would care to comment.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Colin McKee, Policy Advisor in Governor Meade's office. And I think where the conversation started last year, we were before the committee to discuss the governor's energy strategy and his desire to find a place to have that within state government past his administration. We obviously, I think conversation or the ending point last year during session was to place the energy strategy with the infrastructure authority for the next couple of years. But the governor does still have a desire to find a place to permanently house the energy strategy. And so I know we discussed this a bit last year. I'll rehash just a bit of what the energy strategy is, the importance of it to Wyoming and to the governor, and then any questions that the committee has, I'd be more than happy to take from there. So when Governor Meade was running for office in 2010, there was no state or federal energy policy, and it was one of his strongest and most high priorities when running for office to create some type of policy, some type of process to create policies for energy and natural resources in Wyoming. He simply felt that it was unacceptable for Wyoming, the energy state. We're sitting in the energy capital of the nation right now. It was unacceptable for the state to not have a more systematic way of developing policies. Now, obviously, there are a number of bodies in Wyoming that do create policy, but he wanted a more comprehensive, systematic way of doing that for the executive branch and ways to partner with the legislative branch. So in developing the framework, the staff in the office had reviewed a number of different plans from other states and the Energy Policy Act of 2005. We reviewed a number of different plans. Ultimately, what was selected was a private sector business model. It is one that Powder River Energy Corp uses and a number of other companies throughout the United States. And what the strategy does is it has an overall vision and then sublying points, but it allows every component, every entity within an entire organization see where it fits into the overall mission, the charge, the vision, and see that pathway up to achieving what we're attempting to achieve with energy and natural resource development in Wyoming. The four primary areas of policy that were tranched in the governor's energy strategy covered economic development. There's a regulatory component, natural resource conservation, and then education, innovation, and new technologies. And through those four different categories, we believe that essentially any energy policies can fit into one of those areas. The policies cover or go through a number of different agencies throughout the state. So we have had assistance from DEQ, from the Oil and Gas Commission. The governor's office takes charge of implementing a number of the initiatives. Department of Ag, University, we've worked with them. Game and Fish, the energy strategy, and the agencies who are integral in implementing these policies is really broad across the state. And so It's been through this framework that the governor's been able and the state has been able to have a more concerted and comprehensive development and implementation process for policies. Some of the initiatives that have been developed through this process, there's the CO2 pipeline corridor. There were a number of updates and overhauls to regulations at the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. There's the Natural Resource Energy Explorer tool, which Teal will speak about here shortly. So there's a development process. There's another important component to the energy strategy, and that's a forum to highlight the policies that the state of Wyoming has set for itself for energy and natural resource issues. So the Integrated Test Center, I think, is a great example of that. That was, an initiative that was created through work with private sector, with the executive branch, legislative branch, and others. The governor put that in his 2016 energy strategy because he wanted to highlight the importance of that policy for Wyoming. And it's been said, if you don't market, if you don't communicate what you're doing in the state, then folks won't know what you're doing. Now, the ITC is obviously marketed in a number of different ways, but that's one form of showing folks what it is we're doing here.
Mr. McKee, I want to
yes, sir.
Just interrupt, and sorry. It's a thing I was trying to put my finger on with this. And again, like when we started, I had read the Energy Commission report that was done 12, 15 years ago. And some of these same concepts of statewide policy, and then how do we get, but the thing to try to put my finger on is how do we get it implemented? We can identify a policy of conservation, of maximizing, certain assets, a lot of the good things we've done, the water testing, baseline testing. How do we go about implementing that? What discussions have you had or are within the governor's office of the best mechanism to see that these policies are implemented, followed, and pursued? Followed, pursued, whatever. Yeah, I can think of one more.
Mr. Chairman, it's a great question, and I think there are pros and cons to a number of approaches. So, last year when we started these discussions, we came up with 4 or 5 different approaches that we could take. There are positions in statute, like a state planning coordinator who is housed in the governor's office and is charged with overseeing all federal land management issues. So there was a consideration of creating a energy strategy advisor and placing that in the governor's office. So that keeps these efforts very close to future governors, but it also, if there's a future governor that doesn't particularly like this process, then they can just not hire that strategy advisor. There was the energy council that was developed in the bill last year, and I know there was some concern now that we're creating another council to oversee energy policy development when we have different entities already working in certain areas. I don't know if there is right now I don't think there's, we put it with the Infrastructure Authority, as Jason alluded to, and as Brian alluded to, they will take direction from the legislature, and they're happy to carry out the missions that they get. There's not many logical places right now. I don't think it would fit well at the Oil and Gas Commission. They're a regulatory body. They're not a policy development body. It wouldn't fit well at DEQ or at the Business Council. There's not a logical place at this moment without some perhaps additional resources or, so very good question. We are more than happy to see what the legislature has to say on the matter, though.
I guess I would have just assumed there would have been a stronger opinion on that. But, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Colin, is there any funds set aside, or was that bill going to fund the council, the position in the governor's office. Was that the intention of that bill, or was there already funds available that would go with that position, I believe?
So, Mr. Chairman, if I remember correctly, if I remember correctly, the Business Council was charged with staffing the newly created Energy Council, and if I remember right, I don't think there was an appropriation with that bill. Yeah. So, and Mr. Chairman, I guess to that to your prior question, where we came to last year was the development of an Energy Council. We did think that that was the most appropriate avenue to take this. The council was appointed by the governor, so future governors would have a role to play in how this council would be composed, but it would also be, somewhat removed, a little bit autonomous to be able to develop policies, that the council felt were best for the state. It had a mix of energy, industry, conservation, public interest members on that council, so the policies and initiatives that were developed were well balanced. And then I believe the intent was if there were any initiatives that required funding, then the council or the business council, whoever it was, would come to the legislature and request funds. So that's where we landed last year, and that is what we thought was a pretty strong move, but obviously the bill did not go forward.
Yeah, and just with that, and I appreciate the concept of developing policy, but again, I look at folks like Brian and Jason. I mean, the boots on the ground for the implementation that are out to make sure and drive those initiatives further than the concepts of. So that's kind of what I was looking at. I think that is what. When this subject came forward in terms of an energy authority and the strategy is how do we meld those two together so we make sure that we have a good solid energy strategy and an all of the above energy strategy, I think is something that we have to be aware of here in the state. And then how do we manage that and make sure that we've got boots on the ground to make sure that the initiatives are followed or pursued. And again, when we're talking about diversification of the economy and value added, these are key tools, key initiatives that we need to be following.
Yeah. So, Mr. Chairman, for my experience with the energy strategy is you do need someone to lead the efforts, to be responsible for coordinating groups at the outset of getting the different interests together and figuring out what it is that the state should be doing, and then, developing the initiatives and the policies. A lot of the work, though, does rest with the agencies because they're the ones with expertise in these areas, and so, there's not necessarily one person who is in charge of developing and implementing, everything. We've had over 80 different action items or initiatives through the various items in the energy strategy and water strategy. One person can't do that, but like I mentioned, we have charged the Oil and Gas Commission, Business Council, DEQ, others with implementing a number of these initiatives. So it's really a statewide, systemic deal to accomplish the tasks in the energy strategy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Looking at the models and the concept of the commission that we looked at last year, an energy commission, one of the concerns that I have with that, I'd be interested to hear what the views were from the governor's office, is we've probably already got about 4 boards and commissions related to energy policy right now. If we created another one that was the Energy Commission that somehow overlaps all of the responsibilities of their boards and commissions. Boards and commissions are notoriously slow at doing work. They're not the on the ground that the chairman was talking about. They typically volunteer, paid zero or something close to it, and we're relying on their goodwill, so we can't really have an expectation of them doing the hard work and getting things done quickly. So I think a commission might be a good idea, but it's not necessarily sufficient to carry out what the commission comes up with, and again, interacting with these other commissions. So what was the vision or the intended vision for that legislation about the commission and how it would interact with the Infrastructure Authorities Board, the Pipeline Authorities Board, we've got EORI's board, we've got the School of Energy Resources, the board that oversees them. We just have a number of other ones. How was that envisioned to interact with all of the other groups, or was it supposed to maybe be an oversight entity?
Mr. Chairman and Senator, I don't think it had an oversight role to play in any of that. I think the other boards and commissions that are in existence right now might have more narrow or specific focus, maybe more technical, more infrastructure, more natural gas oriented. The Energy Strategy Committee or Council would be much more broad and much more comprehensive. They would all work together. Again, I think any of the other boards would continue to do the work that they're doing, but if there were a particular policy or initiative that really needed to be highlighted or get some extra momentum, or if the energy, those could be pulled from another commission up to the Energy Council, or they could be worked on jointly. So I think the Energy Council we were contemplating last year had just a much broader mandate to look at energy in an economic development sense, and a regulatory and a natural resource conservation, to look at things like the ITC. I know you'd made a comment last year, why don't we come up with an initiative to help solve the state's $400 million or whatever, the number is, revenue deficit. You could have, initiatives that would try to look at issues like that if it's appropriate for this type of Energy Council to look at. As far as getting the initiatives done, as completing them, the Energy Council was to have a report developed that would be presented to the Minerals Committee, and I believe from there the Minerals Committee could charge different agencies with implementation of whatever initiatives are correct. I think the step before that, the study, the energy strategy document, was presented to the governor for his consideration and development of a budget. And then and then the Energy Council is also consulting with the Minerals Committee through the interim. So there was kind of a combined process there if there were items to be implemented.
Any further questions? Mr. McKee? All right. Well, we appreciate you coming back and participating in the conversation. Dr. Carpenter, if you're ready, we'll move along. I can feel Senator Anderson kicking me from clear down here, so we'll keep moving.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you will indulge me, I have presented a PowerPoint presentation to you that has 25 slides. If you'll allow me to make two statements, I will guarantee you that I will only use 10 of those slides. The first statement is I want to use those slides to hopefully answer the question more specifically of what we do on a very focused basis, and hopefully answer some of the questions that you've asked of others so you don't have to re-ask them to me. And secondly, to answer what the commission thought was the original question. And I qualify it by saying original question because based on Senator Von Flatern's description and context today, I'm going to offer a slightly modified response. If with your permission, on slide number 3 shows the Enhanced Oil Recovery Commission. That is the gubernatorially appointed statutory commission, ex officio of the governor, a member of the Wyoming Legislature, ex officio of the state geologist, and then there are standing members from the Wyoming Oil and Gas Commission, a member of the University of Wyoming trustees, and then 3 members at large, which you see there. What I would bring to your attention is we have 3 new members, which are different from what we heard last time. We have a new state geologist, Ken Hendricks as the new member of the Wyoming Oil and Gas Commission, and Bob King. If I could get you to slide 4, is our mission. It comes right out of statute. It's relatively straightforward. Our job is to look at increasing reserves and production that might not otherwise be occurring, i.e. enhanced oil recovery, and that does come straight out of the statute that the legislature created. Drawing your attention to slide number 9, we're very proud of some specific work that we have recently completed. We used $500,000 of monies to put on the street with a one-to-one match from industry to say, we'll put in $1, you put in $1 to do research. Our expectation was to take $500,000 and leverage it to $1 million of research. To our great surprise, we've leveraged almost $2.2 million worth of research, almost a 5-to-1 return. We've got great projects with wonderful Wyoming operators looking at a diverse cross-section of issues that we've been trying to wrestle with. It's amazing when you ask people, tell me what keeps you up at night or what problem we can help you fix. They don't have a lot to say. When I say I've got $500,000 to buy that answer from you, lots of people show up. So this has been a great, successful program for us. Will generate a lot of work.
Just to help me with, when times are better, we set aside funds for our matching funds. How were those managed again?
The matching funds that you may be referring to, Mr. Chairman, I think precede my tenure as the director. These funds are part of our standing budget, our standard budget that we came in to do projects, as opposed to us identifying a particular project to go do. We solicited people to bring projects to us and funded those out of our general revenue budget.
Okay, yeah. The other, I think, was, let's say it was through the School of Energy Resources. We used that with some of the projects with Dr. Puri. So, okay.
I believe you're correct in that regard.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I get all of it confused.
I understand completely. Slide 13 is our technical advisory board. So in addition to our commission, we have a host of professionals that are available to us and to Wyoming stakeholders free of charge for service. One change from when we were here last, Ken Hendricks was a member of the TAB, has had to step aside as a member of the Oil and Gas Commission, and Robbie Rocky from Fleur-de-Lis has replaced him. If I could draw your attention to slide 15. What's interesting in slide 15, the black, those are electricity costs from our neighboring states that are energy intensive. And the black line is Wyoming. Historically, Wyoming was the low energy provider. Therefore, we were the place to go to do work, to generate natural resource extraction. We're no longer the low-cost energy provider. It costs more for lifting costs in Wyoming than it has previously, and it costs more compared to our competitors. We're doing a significant amount of work on the economics of why that's happening, how can that be addressed, what can happen from a technological standpoint and from an electricity generation standpoint to help address that issue. That economic piece is a key point of what we do. If I could draw your attention to slide 19. Slide 19 is sort of how we put a bow on things. We have pivoted from doing more traditional academic research. Historically, let me hit the pause button and take a step back for a moment. Our commission is gubernatorially appointed, and I report to them strategically. That is, I get the direction of what we ought to do and what we ought not to do. On a tactical day-to-day basis, I report to Mark Northam at the School of Energy Resources. So I have 2 bosses. Actually, I have 9 bosses. I have a commission that gives that strategic, do these kinds of things, don't do these kinds of things. And then through the School of Energy Resources, we live under the umbrella of SCR. The commission members are state employees as UW employees. We live and operate within the university system for our payroll and HR and other things. But that's the mechanism by which we operate. Having said that, we have moved and relocated from Laramie to Casper for the purpose of being more applied research instead of academic. We've made that pivot to get away from academics to be more downhole, and data management, big data, data analytics is the future of where things are going. We have a significant amount of data available to us. You heard Director Jeffrey speak about the Wyoming Pipeline Authority. They are by far the authority of pipeline data in the state of Wyoming. We access their database and use that. We put a big bow on all of our work and try and make it available to the public. This is one of my other indulgences I'll ask of the chair. I'm assuming many of you have seen the Marine Corps movie, A Few Good Men. When Jack Nicholson is on trial, the Marines are asked ahead of time, show me the SOP. Where do you do this? How do you do that? And he is asked, where do you go to eat? And the answer is, well, I just follow the Marines and I go to the mess hall to eat. The point I'm making here is, while it's not explicit how the Pipeline Authority, the Infrastructure Authority, EOR, and SIR, it's not explicit that we work together, but we implicitly work together. We all know what roles we each play. And when we are asked, when a developer comes to us and says, I need help with X, we're the answers, we solve that. If they ask for something that's outside of our jurisdiction, we automatically send them to the right appropriate folks who can answer those questions. So from our perspective as an EOR who has a very specific focus on generating oil and gas production, our ability to get project developers in isn't impeded by the question you're asking. And so it's with that I'll ask you to draw your attention to slide 24. There's a memo that's attached. This is a summary of the memo. Our commission was asked to consider, the original quest was merging with and being part of a one-stop energy shop. And our commission has suggested that that's not in the commission's or the state's best interest for the Institute to be part of that in that regard. Here's where I'm going to make a qualifying statement. Based on what Senator Van Vleteren had suggested today, if the question is talking and interacting with each other and meeting to share who you're meeting with, what problems people are having, we would absolutely support that. We would participate in that and be willing to engage in whatever capacity you ask us. But from a commission's request of would we participate in being in an oversighted, authority-driven member of that, their respectful request was they would think that's not in the best interest of both the commission or the state. And with that, I have reached my 7 slides and would entertain any questions you might have.
Yeah, Representative Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm very interested in learning, if you can tell me, what, if anything, you're doing with or considering with regard to application of artificial intelligence in your research.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Henderson, we're doing quite a lot, not as much as I'd like to do. We're growing. That's a growing field. We use what's called neural networks. If you're an oil and gas person, you understand what a core and a log looks like. From that log, you can generate permeability and porosity. Therefore, you can make business decisions about is there oil, and more importantly, can you get it out? Historically, the tools to generate permeability and porosity didn't exist. And so there are data mechanisms, data-driven modeling that allows you to take old logs that don't include those kinds of data and artificially generate artificial data points that allow you to then model and move forward. It's becoming a significant part of what we do. It's certainly a significant part of how the industry reacts. If you look at the large players, if you look at Devon, if you look at EOG, they actually have artificial intelligence organizations within their companies now whose sole focus is to manage data and crunch numbers. We certainly aren't at that level. I would argue that the Institute has the largest, best, most complete oil and gas data set for Wyoming anywhere in the world. Because we have access to all the publicly available data, we have access to all of the Oil and Gas Commission regulatory-driven data, and because of our alumni, we have folks who retire and say, listen, I'm going to retire now. Here's 5 drawers full of data you can have. And because of the projects that we do, and because this is public money, all of that project data lives in the public domain. And so I argue that the data set we have is available to us to allow to do things. I didn't take the time. There are several projects in this slide deck that only occur because we have the ability to look at artificial intelligence and what's also called machine learning today.
Do you have a question?
I do, but
okay. Well, we're here to ask questions and to learn, so go ahead, Representative Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am quite interested in your application of your data arm because I come from a part of the industry where it was my job to do reservoir analysis and modeling based off of well logs and tying them to the existing seismic. So what you're saying is you have this capability with inside. Are you providing the data for other entities to do this modeling and basically connect the dots to the modeling? Or are you part of that strategy?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Burr, the answer is both. And let me qualify that answer. We have data that, for the most part, is available to the public. Sometimes we get private data that is under a confidentiality agreement that we can only use for that particular issue. Some of the commercial data that we've purchased, we can only use in certain manners. But it's our intent to model that data. Now, we typically do that in conjunction with an operator. So as an example, operator A will come to us and say, we're really struggling to figure out how to look at our sweep efficiency. If we bring all of our data to the table, can we look at your data set and see if you have data within our field that we might not have? Collectively, we combine that data, and then we do the modeling. We do the data analysis and see what the answer is. Now, the qualifying piece I have to this is, unlike the two authorities who have bonding capacity, we accept general revenue funds. The work that we do is all in the public domain. So I can solve your problem for your reservoir so long as two things occur. First, whatever we do is going to be shared in the public domain. And secondly, I can't be considered the in-house, out-of-house consulting firm for you. The problem you have has to be bigger, that if I solve it, it also solves problems for other Wyoming operators. So the problem has to be, and I'll use an example, paraffin for an example. If you have a paraffin problem, if I fix it for you, I will likely fix it for other operators who struggle with the same thing. If you have a water issue, if I solve it, we will likely solve it for all the other oil and gas analogies that exist out there. So we walk that fine line of saying we do projects, but the projects have to have a broad application beyond a single solving your problem. It has to be a wider Wyoming problem. And I hope that answered your question.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Representative.
Yes, that does, but it leads to another question, because in that industry, I know people who made lots and lots of money by basically brokering what you're describing there. And I would like to know that I guess you alluded to a quid pro quo of data exchange and information exchange. Are we in a position that we should be looking at this as a potential revenue source, or should that be off of the table in this discussion?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Byrd, I would suggest the latter. It's off the table, and let me explain to you why. Most of the projects, the example I gave you, most of the projects we do are for small independent Wyoming operators. The EOGs of the world, the Chesapeakes of the world don't need our help. They have all the data they need. They have all the people they need. We have access to about $5 million a year of subscription fees for software. Schlumberger's Petrel, Eclipse, CMG, the modeling softwares that industry uses. Most small independent operators can't afford to have access to that. It was the intent of the formation of the Institute, based on historical knowledge that was shared with me, that in a downturn, when the majors left, many small independent operators had the opportunity, if they operated along with Marathon or Exxon or BP, they could go to Casper and sit with their reservoir engineers and talk about their collective assets. When the majors left, that asset disappeared, and the small independent operators had no one to turn to. And so our institute was created to fill that void. So the long-winded answer is to say the lion's share of the work we do for the small independent Wyoming operators who has no ability to pay the $3 million a year subscription that Schlumberger charges for Petrel, nor do they have a staff of geologists and engineers. If they're not doing oil work, they're doing ranching work. And so we provide that service based on the legislator's desire to fill that void. So yes, it's easy to say, let's generate revenue. My fear with that is that the minute we do that, A, the big boys won't need us and they won't come, and B, the small independents won't be able to afford to pay that. And because we're publicly funded, our view is everything we do is in the public domain, and therefore it's shared for the benefit of all Wyoming operators. Now, that doesn't say, if I might expand a bit, it doesn't, very similar to Director Jeffrey's comment that there's 136 attempts a day to get to their database. That doesn't mean that people don't show up for the purpose of trying to exploit that and use that. And so we're very specific about the data we have is for this particular project, and we don't allow outside folks to just come in and have our data. We try and filter that through so that we have a public face called WIRIT. It's the Wyoming Reservoir Information Tool. It's on our website. It's a web-based platform that anybody can have. You can break it, tear it up, and use it any way you want. The lion's share of the data is behind that we have to sit down and have a conversation, understand what you want and why you want before we let you behind the curtain, as it were.
Okay, I think, Dr. Northam, were you itching to comment and give us some great knowledge?
Thank you very much. Mark Northam, Director of School of Energy Resources again. There is a point C of why we can't do that, and that is EORI is not allowed to compete with the private sector. We had a laboratory where we did technical service for companies, and we had to shut it down because there are other laboratories in the state that provide that same service, and we could provide it cheaper because we have state support. So if he was to try to charge for the things they do, then we're in competition with the private sector, and that would be, I think, constitutionally, but at least statutorily prohibited. So that's point C to your A and B.
As I said, I have 9 bosses.
Yeah, a very important point C, yes. Okay, I have a quick question, we'll move on, but in terms of, so right now we do have the initiative for carbon capture and utilization, and that goes hand in hand, hand in glove with enhanced oil recovery. So what, just a little bit, I mean, I saw you and Mr. Beggar sitting there together back and forth and talking, and I've noticed that many times, but is there anything more that, are there any gaps, I guess? That was a question I'd asked earlier, that you see with somebody with a new idea or somebody gets passed around to agencies or doesn't quite fall in?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the answer to that is communication is always good. And Jason and I talk typically when there's a need. So I would say the gap is there's likely an opportunity that he hasn't shared with us because he hasn't seen a need that we don't know about, that should we come together twice a year and sit together for 4 hours and say, what are you doing? Who's called you? What are the issues? I think that would resolve any of those issues. Again, this is that notion of we all know what our specific role is, and certainly for us it's very specific and bound. And so when we get requests that are outside of that, we draw the boundaries and say that's not us, it's them, and we think we know who those people are. I think putting us together twice a year and forcing us to talk and interact, I think has great value. And you would likely generate more synergies. You would likely find something that you didn't know existed that you would talk in advance. But from a standpoint today, is if there's a gap in a hole, my answer is no, there isn't, because we're dealing on a one-off basis. When we have issues or they have issues, we're reaching out to communicate with each other.
Okay. And I'm still, I guess I'm the only one with questions. Right? Okay, sorry. So in my 8 years, what I've seen is we've had this legislative desire, or at least a desire of this committee to see a movement forward on some front, and we've seen that go from, it was coal to liquids, gas to liquids. Now we were out front and we were looking at carbon sequestration. Now we're looking at carbon capture and then carbon utilization. And I just, when times were better, we would put money behind initiatives. And I guess anytime you're trying to get better, move forward, some things work, some don't. But I'm just looking where, with resources that are tight, what can we do as a state? I mean, what can we do? The University of Wyoming, your group, everybody. What can we do to make sure that we're picking the right initiative and headed down the right road?
Mr. Chairman, I think the easy answer is every one of the, and I say everyone, infrastructure, pipeline, EORI, SER has a board. Those boards can talk to one another. In many cases, legislators are on those boards. In many cases, you have people, same folks on multiple boards. I don't think there's any reason why those boards ought not to talk. I also don't think there's a bad idea with suggesting, or say we use the more strong word of mandate, that those commissions and authorities get together at least once a year and talk. I don't know what Director Jeffries doesn't know, because we don't talk that often. I don't think talking is ever bad. Communicating is a great thing, and having us come together, let's say at the end of the day, it costs you 2 days, a couple hours to travel somewhere, meet half a day and go home. You do it twice a year. 2 days investment by the directors of those agencies and or those boards, I think would garner an awful lot of investment. I don't think it necessarily has to be mandated. I realize the governor has a strategy that you all are wrestling with. How do you implement and make it go forward? But from my perspective, and again, that's a focused EOR perspective, the pieces, parts of the puzzle that we need to have, we reach out when we need to have them. I think it would be a manner of leadership and certainly a manner of suggestion that you all, and then all being the 4 other entities that you think ought to get together, should talk. Remember that many of these organizations do talk. And so we are across the parking lot from the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. Director or Superintendent Watson probably sees too much of us. So there's the notion of, are we seeing each other too often or not enough? Many of us have perspectives that I'm talking to Brian often enough, or I'm talking to Jason often enough. But their perspective, maybe it's not enough. And so setting a standard to say, listen, at least twice a year, you guys are going to get together and, in essence, do what we did here today. That presentation that we heard from the other 2 authorities had some value for us. There's some takeaways, some things we learned, and the hope is that our presentation did the same. That's an easy fix that doesn't need a legislative mandate to do. We all work for you. If you simply tell us to get together twice a year, I could see that happening.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Carpenter. So, Teal, are you ready? This is, it's kind of, we asked, the work that you're doing is quite interesting, and it ties in with the governor's energy strategy, and I think maybe have you explain who you work for, how you're funded, what you're working on, and who you work with, please.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Everyone, I am Teal Lykoff, and I work for the University of Wyoming, and specifically for the Wyoming Geographic Information Science Center. So we are a research center at the university. You all have some prepared slides. In the interest of time, I am going to follow Dr. Carpenter's lead, and I'm going to just focus on the first few. The addition, pretty much beyond slide 8, are going to be for your future reference. I can answer questions to those as needed. The Wyoming Geographic Information Science Center is an interdisciplinary research center, and we have 3 main focuses of our mission. The first is research and development. We are a geospatial center, and so we are kind of cross-disciplinary. From a functional standpoint, we sit directly under academic affairs at the university, so we are not affiliated with a specific department. We also, of course, are involved in education. We have several folks. We have 4 positions that actually are university-funded positions. And then our last component is service and outreach, and that is really where 85% of us, we're about a 20-person organization, and that is where the rest of us sit. That means we are essentially soft-funded. We are funded by the work that we bring in the door. I am part of that service and outreach component, and that is part of what I'm going to talk about today related to NREX. The next slide, slide 3, I'm just going to touch briefly on some of the work we do. That service and outreach is focused primarily, almost exclusively, on the state of Wyoming. So a lot of what we do is to support the geospatial needs of state agencies and of other entities that operate in this state. Several of the things that have been talked about today, several of the topics, we have been, from a behind-the-scenes perspective, involved in. Dr. Carpenter just mentioned the WYRIT, the Wyoming Reservoir Information Tool. We helped in the development of that. We are not the data creator. They are the data manager for those data. But in terms of developing this online application or system to support others' access to that information, that is where we come into play. Develop online decision support tools to support natural resource decision making here in Wyoming. Now, we also work with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department on regulatory processes for the Sage Grouse Core Area Initiative, for example. And we also work with the governor's office in supporting and providing geospatial data to the state of Wyoming. Now, I am here today specifically to talk about the acronym is NREX. It's the Natural Resource and Energy Explorer tool. And that will start here on slide 4. NREX is a web-based set of geospatial tools that is intended to support natural resource decision-making here in Wyoming. Now, as we know, we are a development state, we are an energy state. And one of the most critical components is to have the data in order to make informed decisions about this. And we would argue that all data are spatial, right? Everything, a lot of the decisions that we make and the information we need in order to make those decisions has a tie to space. So making all of that information geospatial. On slide 5, as Colin introduced earlier, NREX was born out of the governor's energy strategy. It was a part of the first energy strategy that came out in the autumn of 2013. In that, Governor Mead outlined the Energy Atlas concept to provide public access to credible geographic data and information maintained by state agencies and other sources. We have come a long way, and as you are all familiar, technology is constantly changing. So we are constantly, as a state, needing to keep up with that technology. In terms of bringing, and then there's also, the bottom line here is that, any tool that we develop to provide that information is only as good as the data that is going into it. We rely on the agencies to provide that information. Moving on to the next slide, slide 6, project development. So, Energy Atlas concept as a part of the governor's energy strategy. This is an idea that came out of that effort. And in order to guide and develop that, the governor's policy office was directly involved from a vision and development guidance. Really what this tool was intended to do was to be a synthesis, to bring together all of the agency data that we all have access to in some way, shape, or form, but if you didn't have specialized software, you really couldn't actually access that information. So I think that the part of that vision that came out of that strategy was great. We need to get this information and data in a synthesized way so that all of us, everyone who needs to make decisions, can actually get their hands on it and be able to view this in a single space. And that was a pretty big directive, and it crossed a wide variety of data thematic topics. So whereas in the past, we had developed tools that were specific to, say, wildlife or energy, this directive was we also want to see socioeconomic information in order to be able to make informed decisions with that, as well as cultural resources. If we are developing a particular place in the state, we want to be able to do an initial assessment that says, we're going to, be able to access these rail or road resources, or we're going to need to communicate with the Game and Fish Department about these particular species of conservation need, or with cultural resources with the SHPO office. So to direct the development of this tool, we also had the Business Council, and then we at WYGIS were the development partner. Now, we also had several other committees that oversaw the development. And then, of course, one of the biggest components here, as I mentioned before, the data are really the most important component. And so from my perspective of over a decade of working in geospatial data with this state, this effort that came out of the governor's energy strategy has been the most successful in coordinating state agencies and data sharing in a collaborative effort to be able to provide an online tool where anyone, be they public, legislators, contractors, developers, or local developers, everyone has access to that same level of information that are provided directly by those agencies. Moving on to slide 7. The target audience is who I just talked about, and this tool provides essentially two things. One, data discovery. This is where a variety. There are hundreds of data sets that are included in this online map application. They run the gamut from water resources and data right down to energy. This tool also, I would say, does not reinvent wheels that have already been invented. We talked about the reservoir information tool. Rather than reincorporating any of the functionality that that tool does, instead, we simply provide a spatial link that you can actually click in this application, and it will bring up the other application as well as all of the reports and data that reference that location in space.
Just a quick question at that point. So how is the data updated? I mean, are those links directly, or are you getting to that?
Nope, that's a great question, because, yeah, some of this I was going to try to keep brief, but I definitely, any questions, definitely, thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I mentioned that I do feel this has been one of the most successful collaborative efforts of contributing data that we have seen to date in Wyoming, that there are a whole gamut. We run the gamut in terms of how that information is shared. We have been developing applications like this for about a decade. And, 10 years ago when we started doing this, it meant that we as in WYJISC, needed to also be the data warehouse of that actual information. We physically were obtaining those data sets, and we were the ones who were sharing them. At this point in time, there is really a whole portfolio of options for how to keep those data up to date. We have, from one end of the spectrum, and this is kind of the direction that we wanted to head, we are hitting live data from those agencies that are provided out as map services directly from their servers. What that means is we are not housing or maintaining a copy of the data at the data center at the University of Wyoming. Rather, we are simply touching their data in a live stream. Those data remain in the control of that agency. Other agencies are potentially not quite there yet in terms of having the physical infrastructure to support that. Another example is a data sharing relationship where, and this is actually with SHPO example, we have scripts that run nightly, given our handshake data partnership. They run a script that writes the data to an intermediate place on our servers, and then we run the next script that writes it to the production database. So it's a once every 24 hours, but we're still hosting the data in that case, but we have that data update relationship. And then in between there are some other data sharing relationships where we do physically still obtain data on whatever that annual, quarterly might be.
So now I see a true application for the blockchain technology security and access and layers of data. Representative Lindholm's not even here. Okay.
Ms. Wyckoff, you didn't actually say, you did say that the 4 people are university employees, I believe. How about yourself and the budget for your department? Is that separate, or is that all part of the block grant we give the university? How is that paid for?
Sure, that's a great question, Mr. Chairman and Senator Van Vladeren. We have a small component of the state block grant that funds those 4 academic positions. Those 4 folks have dual responsibilities. They are half of their percent, or 25% actually, is a teaching responsibility in a department, and the remainder of that is with WYJISC. For the other 85% of us, we are funded by, including myself, 100%, funded by the projects that we work on. So in the case of NREX, for example, that is a project that we are essentially a contractor. We like to think of ourselves as a partner in these because we have investment in this state, and we are here for the long term and are invested in our natural resources. But when it comes down to it, we are essentially a contractor, and we are contracted to develop and maintain these tools. So in this case, that partner is the Business Council. In some of our other cases, we are contracted directly by the governor's office. We have multiple contracts with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. We work with, from a federal perspective, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, et cetera.
So on that, you actually, like Game and Fish, you'll say it'll cost you, $1,000 for this year, and so then you take, so that's how your budget is derived. Okay, thank you.
So just a follow-up question to that. I'm sorry, go ahead, Representative.
So you're basically a clearinghouse for the information?
Yes, thank you for that question.
So all the individual agencies are actually responsible for maintaining the data in a viable form or putting it in the system correctly?
Sure. That is correct, and if I may, I will elaborate, Mr. Chairman and Representative Crank. There are, yes, I would say that bottom line, the agency who is the authority on those data is almost always the authority who provides those updates of the data to us. We also do serve in another capacity of developing data if asked. And so, there are some cases where that agency may not have the capacity to either develop or maintain those data. And so they, in that case, would contract with us to do that. But I would say in the vast majority of cases, those agencies are solely responsible, and we are simply the intermediary of bringing those data together in order to provide them out in a comprehensive manner.
So I think you touched on a concern of mine, great initiative for the state of Wyoming, all the way across the board. But the agencies are participating because the governor has told them to. They're taking money out of their budgets and paying for the service because their chief executive has told them to. And so as we sit here in an election year, these are the things I worry about, and part of the reason we have this discussion is how do we make sure these great initiatives don't get left behind?
That is an excellent question, Mr. Chairman. And in terms of, my comments to that, I think that definitely in terms of it being an election year and the fact that, I would say that geospatial data being a foundation of all of the decisions that we make and all of the processes that need to continue, it is something that should, where possible, remain in a sustainable manner that can continue to be funded and can actually cross that bridge. It is certainly, a potentially volatile position to have it be something that could go away with an administration. That is certainly a concern, I would agree. That's all I had. I'll stop there.
It's awesome. I mean, I think this is one of the greatest initiatives we've had. It's very useful. Any questions from the committee? Okay, well, I appreciate you coming up, going through this with us. We're at that point in time then. Any public comment on this, the concept of, I guess it was an overall concept of an energy authority, energy strategy? Anyone wishes to speak any further? Okay. Well, I think with that, my co-chair and I have discussed, I think we'll let this particular issue percolate just a little bit more, which means that we can move on to adjournment and see everybody at 8 o'clock tomorrow. So I'll entertain a motion.
A quick announcement. The Nature Conservancy is having a reception for the committee. Well, they're having a reception for themselves too, but the committee's invited, and it's at 6:30 at the AVA, Visual Arts, Advocates for Visual Arts, which is at the corner of 4J Road and 2nd Street. This is 4J Road, this main road out here. You take it to the end, in the stoplight and the big highway in front of you, which would be a 4-laner. They're right on the right, so take this about 8 or 10 blocks. They're right on the corner of 4J Road and 1416 or 2nd Avenue in Gillette. Right, it's right by the Legion. If you know where the Legion is, you know where Ava is.
Okay. I need a motion to adjourn, don't I? So moved. Okay, it's been moved. All right. We're adjourned till 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Thank you, everyone.